Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger is making the case that his company's technology will be vital to an industry-wide boom in artificial intelligence computing. Intel down today by 1.6%. And former President Bill Clinton teaming up with Israeli billionaire Ziv Aviram to launch a climate fund with about $1 billion of startup capital. Aviram is the co-founder of Mobileye. Again, recapping S&P 500 index down 14, down 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you, and welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, alongside Kaylee Lines, who joins us every day at this time. And Kaylee, we're waiting for remarks from President Zelensky. He's speaking at the UN on the heels of President Biden's address. And of course, we're waiting for his arrival later this week in Washington.
Yeah, we are. He'll be at both the White House and Capitol Hill, where I imagine his message will be pretty similar to what we're going to hear him say at the UN today. And that is, thank you for helping us. Please continue to help us. Of course, President Biden was also making his own plea for all of those countries gathered at the UN to continue their support for Ukraine amid the ongoing war with Russia. And we know that Zelensky's probably going to continue to ask for that as well. What's happening at the UN, though, does sit in stark contrast in comparison to what's happening on Capitol Hill domestically with the U.S. when it comes to that funding for Ukraine and the battle over it in Congress.
Well, pretty perfect time to be talking with Jane Harman. She's with us at the table here. Chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, of course, former ranking member, House Intelligence Committee. You have like the longest business card. I couldn't possibly regurgitate the whole thing. It's wonderful to see you, and thanks for being here at this moment.
Happy to be here in person.
In person, no less. This is great. If you're with us on YouTube, by the way, or if you're not, you should be. Search Bloomberg Global News, and you can join us in studio here and watch and listen to Jane Harman. How important is this address at the UN for President Zelensky?
It's big. He has a huge audience. There are about 145 heads of countries there. Not the other four members of the Security Council with veto power. Only the U.S. is there in that capacity. But it's a very big audience for him, and everyone is listening.
Apparently, he's stepping up to the podium right now. Let's listen to some remarks here from the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, live at the UN.
This whole so many wars, but not as active defender against the aggressions. In many cases, the fear of war, the final war, was the loudest here, the war after which no one would gather in the General Assembly Hall again. The Third World War was seen as a nuclear war, a conflict between states on the highway to nukes. Other wars seemed less scary compared to a threat of the so-called great powers firing their nuclear stockpiles. So the 20th century taught the world to restrain from the use of the weapons of mass destruction, not to deploy, not to proliferate, not to threaten with, and not to test, but to promote a complete nuclear disarmament. Frankly, this is a good strategy, but it should not be the only strategy to protect the world from the final war. Ukraine gave up its third largest nuclear arsenal. The world then decided Russia should become a keeper of such power. Yet history shows it was Russia who deserved nuclear disarmament the most back in 1990s. And Russia deserves it now. Terrorists have no right to hold nuclear weapons. No right. But truly, not the nukes are the scariest now. While nukes remain in place, the mass destruction is gaining its momentum. The aggressor is weaponizing many other things, and those things are used not only against our country, but against all of yours as well. Fellow leaders, there are many conventions that restrict weapons, but there are no real restrictions on weaponization. First, let me give you an example. The food. Since the start of the full-scale war, the Ukrainian ports in the Black and Azov Seas have been blocked by Russia. Until now, our ports on the Danube River remain the target for missiles and drones. And it is a clear Russia's attempt to weaponize the food shortage on the global market in exchange for recognition for some, if not all, of the captured territories. Russia is launching the food prices as weapons. The impact spans from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Southeast Asia, and this is the threat scale. And I would like to thank those leaders who supported our Black Sea Grain Initiative and program Grain from Ukraine. Thank you so much. United, we made weapons turn back into food again. More than 45 nations saw how important it is to make Ukrainian food products available on the market, from Algeria to Spain to Indonesia and China. And even now, when Russia has undermined the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we are working to ensure food stability. And I hope that many of you will join us in these efforts. We launched a temporary sea export corridor from our ports, and we are working hard to preserve the land routes for grain exports. And it is alarming to see how some our friends in Europe play out solidarity in political theater, making thriller from the grain. And they may seem to play their own role, but in fact, they are helping set the stage to a Moscow actor. Second, weaponization of energy. Many times the world has witnessed Russia using energy as a weapon. Kremlin weaponized oil and gas to weaken the leaders of other countries when they came to the Red Square. And now this threat is even greater. Russia is weaponizing nuclear energy. Not only it is spreading its unreliable nuclear power plant construction technologies, but it is also turning other countries' power plants into real dirty bombs. Look, please, what Russia did to our Zaporizhia power plant. Shelled it, occupied it, and now blackmails others with radiation leaks. Is there any sense to reduce nuclear weapons when Russia is weaponizing nuclear power plants? Scary question. The global security architecture offers no response or protection against such a treacherous radiation threat, and there is no accountability for radiation blackmailers so far. The sword example is children. Unfortunately, various terrorist groups abduct children to put pressure on their families and societies. But never before the mass kidnapping and deportation would become a part of the government policy. Not until now. We know the names of tens of thousands of children and have evidence on hundreds of thousands of others kidnapped by Russia in the occupied territories of Ukraine and later deported. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrant for Putin for this crime. And we are trying to get children back home. But time goes by. What will happen with them? What will happen to them? Those children in Russia are taught to hate Ukraine, and all ties with their families are broken. And this is clearly a genocide. When hatred is weaponized against one nation, it never stops there. Each decade,
Calling it genocide. Again, that's President Zelensky speaking before the UN General Assembly about Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine following the speech we heard earlier from President Biden. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg Radio. As well, joining us on YouTube, we welcome our viewers as we spend some time with Jane Harman at the table. Again, chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, former ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Jane, it's I guess, prescient your timing to sit here with us as we all listen together to President Zelensky today. In the time that you have with us, connect the dots between this speech and the very difficult conversation it appears that we're about to have in Washington upon his visit this week.
Well, this is, as I understand it, Zelensky's first speech to the UN General Assembly since Russia illegally invaded his country. This will be his second speech to not to Congress as a formal entity, but to members of Congress, and another meeting with President Biden. The Washington part will be tougher, no question. There's a friendly audience at the UN. Russia's not present. The four veto-wielding members of the UN General Assembly, other than the U.S., are not there. So there are 150 countries well represented there, many of whom are receptive to his message, although some are not and think that there are higher priorities. Here, he's going to pitch one thing, which is supplemental funding for his country. Biden is strongly for that. I certainly am strongly for that. Some lead Republicans in the Senate, like Mitch McConnell, are strongly for it, but Kevin McCarthy has basically no room to maneuver and is holding his cards close, and it's not clear yet what will happen. I predict that funding will occur. I can't imagine the U.S. walking back on commitments to not a NATO member, but a NATO neighbor after all that's gone on. So I think Congress weekly, but eventually will get there in the next period.
But if it is weekly that they get there, if it takes a lot of arm wrestling and twisting, and it's difficult to get done, it shows that there is a waning appetite, at least in the U.S., in some parts of it, to continue supporting Ukraine. And that has to ripple around the rest of the world as Biden is pitching to other countries to help.
Well, it's crucial that we be there. More than half the funding of Ukraine by NATO comes from the U.S. We have led. Biden has led. Biden deserves enormous credit for restoring our alliances, something he talked about at the UN earlier today. He really does. But I think this is a manifestation of a broken Congress. There's no agreement on a budget. People want to rein in spending. This is the wrong spending to rein in. I want to rein in spending, too. While in Congress for 9 terms, I was a so-called blue dog. I'm for fiscal responsibility. But this is not responsible to walk back on this war. I mean, after all, if we want to contain authoritarian aggression in the world, the Ukrainians have to win, and we have to help them win.
If anyone does, everyone's a tough guy when they're on a remote interview with an earpiece, or they're yelling at somebody by way of an op-ed, or they're on a cable news network that agrees with them. What happens when Speaker McCarthy is standing in the room with President Zelensky? That's the success that he had upon his last visit when he addressed a joint session of Congress. Can he recreate that?
I think it'll be hard. I think he has made a deal with the devil, meaning that he has absolutely no room to maneuver as Speaker. I think in his heart he knows what the right thing to do is.
So there's no persuasion.
And I don't think he's in favor of closing the government either. He is in favor of cutting spending. But again, so am I, and so are lots of people. But not this way. And I don't know what he'll say. I think it's going to be a very awkward moment for him.
While we're looking ahead to the speech Zelensky is going to give in Washington, that speech at the UN General Assembly is ongoing. He just said we must act united to defeat the aggressor and fight all of these challenges. And Jane, I'd like to point to a Bloomberg opinion piece by one of our colleagues, Andreas Kluth, today, who said Moscow's genocidal invasion of Ukraine is precisely the sort of war of aggression that the UN was meant to prevent and punish, and yet much of the world still refuses to line up behind Biden and the West against Moscow. Does the UN even really serve a real purpose if that is true?
It's a convening authority, and look at all the folks who showed up in New York. I'm sure the traffic is impassable. I'm going up there myself in another day, getting ready for that. But it is not using all the power that it could use. I mean, just think about, and I think Zelensky was mentioning this, the weaponizing of food, the inability of Ukraine to get its ships out because of the Russian blockade. Where's the UN? The UN could be escorting those ships. There's a legitimate question about whether NATO ought to be stepping up, because 3 NATO countries border the Black Sea, which is not territory of Russia. So I don't know what will happen, but I would love to hear the UN itself make some more muscular comments about Ukraine, and I think this would be a good opportunity.
I'd love your thoughts before you leave us on the news that was driving the day at this time yesterday, and that was a prisoner swap with Iran. Secretary of State Blinken spoke, I won't say emotionally, but he was clearly touched by his conversations. We spoke with them moments after they were released. There are Republicans who are criticizing this deal heavily. Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, was on with us last night, who said this was essentially the equivalent of a secret nuclear deal with Iran by unlocking this money, the $6 billion that was involved in the transaction. How would you respond to him?
That's a little overblown. I mean, getting our prisoners back who are unjustly held is a high priority for the U.S. My understanding is we do have means to monitor how this money will be spent. This is money. This isn't our money. This is money that has been embargoed. That is their money. So let's go there. But if it's spent on help for the Ukrainian people, that's in our interest. We would like the Ukrainian people to know our issue isn't with them; it's with their totalitarian government, especially
with
the
repression.
People, you mean?
Yes,
with the Iranian people. Pardon me, with the Ukrainian people, with the Iranian people.
We're talking about a lot of different countries.
Our issue is not with the Iranian people; it's with their repressive government, which, among other things, is doing dreadful things to women and women's rights. And as the chair of the Freedom House board, I'm very happy that we are doing everything we can to protect those women.
So that was the right deal. You'd do it again.
I think we need to know a little more, but yes, that was in the right direction. And I think Tony Blinken being emotional was also right. I think this is a big deal to the American government. Our soft power matters. It's not just hard power. And showing that we care about Americans and human beings detained all over the world is a very high priority for us. And it persuades others to support not President Biden per se, although I do, but to support policies which bring the world back together in favor of freedom and democracy.
We're glad you could join us, Jane. Good luck in New York this week. Travel safe. We look forward to talking again. Jane Harmon, as always, welcome here at the table. On Bloomberg, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, joined by Kaylee Lyons, and the shutdown politics conversation just keeps on rolling. We're going to talk to Nathan Dean in a couple of moments about that, Kaylee, because Ukraine is just one part of it, right? We've been talking about disaster relief funding. Never mind, and those are just the supplemental requests on top of just normal funding of the government with, 12 days to go till a potential shutdown now.
Yes, and even fewer legislative days, which just speaks to how difficult this is for Speaker McCarthy to negotiate, as there are, as we were just discussing with Jane, some members who would not like to see another dollar go to Ukraine. And some of those hardliners, when talking about changes they would like to see in this drafted, agreed, continuing resolution, even agreed upon spending for Ukraine, they would like to not have spent. This is really a sticking point issue, and it's in stark contrast to what we're hearing up in New York, the conversation we're having here in Washington.
A couple of moments with reporters that are worth highlighting for our listeners and viewers from Speaker McCarthy. Listen to the frustration as he's asked about, all of these different factions. Everyone has a problem with something different. You either don't want a CR, or you don't want the supplemental, or you don't want funding at all. Here he is.
I've never seen anybody win a shutdown. You only put the power in the hands of the administration. If you want to secure the border, pass the homeland. If you want to make America strong and secure, you pass the DOD, the Pope's bill. If you're not willing to pass appropriation bills, and you're not willing to pass a continuing resolution to allow you to pass the rest of appropriation bills, and you don't want an omnibus, I don't quite know what you want.
It's like he's thinking out loud. Who are you talking to? Who are you calling
Right.
you? I don't know what you want. He was talking to a reporter, actually. It sounds like he could be talking to any one of his own members.
Totally. And can you find an agreement that gives everyone enough of what they want, that you can get the 218 votes that you need, and it can pass the Senate and be signed by President Biden? Seems like a very, very difficult ask.
That's for sure. That's why we had to talk to Nathan Dean about it. He's always running odds on this stuff. I can't imagine where Bloomberg Intelligence is now. The senior government analyst, Nathan Dean, good to see you, sir.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're living and breathing shutdown politics right now. I know you're covering a lot of different stuff, but on this matter, are we becoming too obsessed with each wrinkle here? Is it actually changing the odds day to day?
Well, it's funny. If you live in Washington, this is what we love and live and breathe with. I mean, this past weekend, the continuing resolution, everybody's paying attention to it. Can this pass? No. If you're up in New York, or if you're paying attention to the markets, there's really no change here. It was 70% chance of a shutdown on Friday. It's 70% chance of a shutdown
You think
today.
only 70?
Well, we don't want to go even higher than that because we're talking about Washington. Anything can happen here.
That's fair.
And so, when we have this conversation next week, we'll probably be at 80. If we have this conversation, after the shutdown, we'll be at 100 and 105%. But the thing to note is that these decisions don't get made until they absolutely have to. And those decisions don't get made 2 weeks before a shutdown. They get made the night before the shutdown or even hours after a shutdown. I mean, this could bleed into a weekend and then it would be an unofficial shutdown. So what we would like to see here is just the continued negotiations. Obviously, this is in Speaker McCarthy's court. I mean, the Democrats are taking the approach of, look, come to the Senate. The Senate is put pretty much, I think, a bipartisan path there. And I'm not sure if Speaker McCarthy can get there. But to your point, what you were just saying, with all those different factions and so forth like that, at the end of the day, I think the Republicans are going to get the blame for this shutdown. And eventually, Speaker McCarthy is going to have to make a choice.
Well, McCarthy has said that.
He just said there, no one ever wins in a shutdown. It was a little bit difficult to hear, but that is clearly his view.
Yeah, and he thinks it might actually serve to benefit the Biden administration and, in theory, by extension, hurt Republicans, to your point. So it also becomes a question, even if we, do get that shutdown, even though you only think it's 70%, how long is it going to last? So, is this going to be like a decade ago?
No, I don't think this is going to be anywhere close to the 35-day shutdown that we had under the Trump administration. I actually think this is going to be probably about a week at most, which I know certainly is not comfort to any government furloughed, non-essential employee or contractor who's going to be out of work for those 5 days. But I think eventually Speaker McCarthy will come around and say, look, we've got to make a deal because this is hurting us politically. Now, that deal is going to be complicated. He's going to need the support of Democrats. And if you get that, then you could potentially have a motion to vacate. But, he's used the language over this past week where he's essentially saying, look, I'm getting to the point where I'm getting frustrated and I'm going to start fighting back. And I see a scenario where he eventually fights back.
Use that gavel as a hammer while he has it, Joe.
Exactly. It could come to that here. Enter Representative Ana Paulina Luna in Florida, speaking with a local news operation. She says, add 3 more days. You said a week? Well, almost.
Sounds like, and I'm just going to inform everyone that's tuning in right now, it sounds like we're going to be going to at least a 10-day government shutdown. But hopefully during that time, people will actually be able to, take time. Look, it's not going to affect Social Security. It's not going to affect Medicare. But the fact is that we need to make sure that we are not, one, funding a bloated government, but also, two, that we're not funding a weaponized government. And so we have to address that as Congress.
I'm not even sure what that last part was, the weaponized.
Well, what some of them are pushing for, in addition to not spending money on Ukraine, is defunding the federal investigations into former President Trump.
Got it.
So I think it's the weaponization of the Justice Department thing.
Never mind the bloat that she refers to there. But 10 days, is that just the last thing that she heard in committee, or what's your thought?
I'm guessing that they were all saying, like, if this is going to be a short term. I mean, I don't think this is, like I said before, I don't think it's going to be 35 days like it was before. But when it comes to the shutdown is that you'll have the weekend, you'll have the first couple of days, people will start to they'll be notified, look, you're not essential. That's not great. Here in Washington, things are going to slowly start grinding as people stop going to work. But then after 7 or 8 days or so, the political cycle and the headline cycle is going to be really bad politics, I think, for the Republicans. And eventually, that's when they realize, look, this is going to start hurting us in poll numbers. By the way, we have an election coming up next year. This is certainly not something that we want to play with. So I think at that point, they make the deal. The one caveat is that Speaker McCarthy also just launched an impeachment inquiry.
Yeah.
A lot of Democrats, I should say not a lot of Democrats, but there were a couple Democrats saying, look, we're open to the idea of working with the Speaker to give him some help here. I think with the impeachment inquiry, that may have disappeared.
Makes it more difficult. And that just speaks to the point, Nathan, that there's still a lot of other business going on Capitol Hill. Yes, the spending fight is first and foremost because there is a clock involved. We are facing a very hard deadline. But at the same time, they're pursuing other things as well, including next week, something that you and I have been long awaiting, and we've talked about, Joe, many times on this program, safe banking.
Yep.
This is related to the marijuana industry, of course. It's been a long time coming. Is it actually going to happen? Because there's a markup in Senate banking next week.
So last week we had talked about it, and I had said a 40% chance over the next 6 months. I still think that's true, but what I'm going to change is my narrative. Instead of taking it a negative light, I'll say 70% passage in 1 year. And I think this can actually pass the committee next week. I mean, look, we've had markups before. Things can always change, but you've got 9 co-sponsors on the Republican side. This bill, which would allow banks to service marijuana businesses, once it gets past committee, then essentially it's up to Chuck Schumer to decide when and if he wants to do this. That's going to require floor time. That's not going to be easy to get in 2023. We have obviously the shutdown. We have other things going on, but he's going to have to spend time to get it off the floor. And then you've got a House. The House has always passed this before under a Democrat. Now you've got a Republican. I think eventually all this can get resolved, but I just don't think it's going to happen ASAP. So I'll change the narrative. I'll say 70% chance in 1 year.
Sure.
Look for this, I think, maybe second quarter of next year, or even if it gets delayed, maybe some of the cleanup work after the election.
You do make a good point. This has passed the House like 15 times, I believe, right? But that was under Speaker Nancy Pelosi. What does Kevin McCarthy make of all this? He's from California.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been much of an issue for Speaker McCarthy and Republican leadership in the House.
He's got a lot of local businesses who are counting on this.
Yeah,
actually,
absolutely. Right? And we've seen a lot of Republican support from random different areas of the country because you've got 38 states that have decriminalized it in some form, and you've got stories like gentlemen taking bags of cash outside of marijuana businesses and being robbed. Because they can't put it in a bank. And so I think this is one of those issues where we've been talking about this for years. I think it's finally gotten to the point where people have recognized, let's not try and attach it to bigger pieces of legislation. Let's not try and actually play games with this. Once they come to an agreement, I think, in the Senate Banking Committee, and my key thing to watch out for is Senator Tim Scott's remarks. If he comes out and says that he's, he may say, I don't like the idea, but, this is something that, wink, wink, nod, nod, then I think, that will give some cover to the Speaker as well.
That's good guidance.
Okay, so he could be a linchpin in this, do you think?
Correct. I mean, he's running for president, and this is something that, we've even seen Governor DeSantis in Florida. Florida has a referendum coming up. It's not like he's really in favor of the idea either at a federal level, so I think whatever Tim Scott says could give some, just a little bit of cover to some of those House Republicans who are on the fence.
It's interesting, Joe, that this could switch not from a conversation about principle, about the idea of actually allowing these businesses to have access to the banking system, but literally just a matter of procedure. You got to have time to get this thing through and make it become law. And time is not something we have an abundance of these days in Washington.
No, that's absolutely right. Although this has been time tested. It's kind of amazing how long we've been talking about this. And just to be clear, by the way, safe bank access to banks, yes, we understand. Would that mean access to credit cards? Would that depend on those companies? Would it allow for stock trading, for instance, on American exchanges? I know a lot of that's been debated, but would have been likely handled in a separate piece of legislation.
So it will allow access to banking and will allow access to banking services. But what we have seen is primarily the large public companies are saying, look, we're not going to touch it until it's federally decriminalized or federally
So
illegal.
MasterCard and Visa may not want to.
Exactly. I mean, you're going to have to still run. You're still going to have to get your KYC, your Know Your Customer programs through. You're going to have to make sure that all of your clients adhere to the Bank Secrecy Act. That's a lot of information that marijuana companies and so forth may not collect. So I think what you're going to see is more state chartered banks. There's about 500 of them in the U.S. right now that are currently serving marijuana businesses. But I think you're going to see these state chartered banks really take up the drive because, look, the revenue is just not worth the risk for a lot of these big institutions.
Got it.
You know what's happening on the same day that the Senate's marking up the safe banking legislation? Gary Gensler is going to the House Financial Services Committee. And I would imagine that one's going to be pretty fun, considering it was a little testy in the Senate last week, and the House tends to be a little bit more fired up on this particular SEC chairman.
Yeah, the Chairman Gensler last week when he testified at the Senate banking, he said in his opening remarks, I'm not going to talk about any litigation, which took out, I think, probably 2/3 of the talking points from the Republican side. Now, obviously, the House Republicans are going to try again. They're not going to care that he has said he's not going to talk about litigation, but you've got questions over crypto. You've got questions over, he talked about analytics and predictive analytics and AI. You've got questions over climate change.
Scope 3,
and so forth like that. I mean, this is, if you're going to grab your popcorn and, watch for one hearing, this is the hearing that you want to do it in. But I will say that Chairman Gensler is one of the best in this town at actually testifying without providing much information.
Yeah.
And, this is the job.
I would actually, just caution that, Chairman Gensler loves this type of stuff. And so, he'll come in, it'll be some fireworks and so forth, and we'll love to talk about it with you all on the radio. But, it's one of those things where he may not provide much in the way of at least guidance and further towards crypto or climate change.
He doesn't really like to make news, as we say,
Look how excited you are for this.
I am.
If you were
I'm
watching us on YouTube,
you'd
see how excited. What day is this again?
The 27th.
All right. You heard it here first. We're good to see you, Nathan, as always. Nathan Dean at Bloomberg Intelligence running the odds for us and helping us understand some pretty important issues on a regular basis here on Sound On. Let's get to the newsroom with Nancy Lyons now, world and national news in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been ticking down how Russia has weaponized so many things in its war on his country. He just told the United Nations there's been a weaponization of food by blocking shipments of grain, a weaponization of energy by turning the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant into a potential dirty bomb, and also a weaponization of Ukraine's children.
We know the names of tens of thousands of children and have evidence on hundreds of thousands of others kidnapped by Russia in the occupied territories of Ukraine and later deported.
Zelensky says those children are now being taught to hate their homeland. He says the world must act now to defeat the Russian aggressor. 5 Americans are back on U.S. soil after being imprisoned in Iran. They touched down in Virginia this morning. The Biden administration agreed to a deal exchanging the group for Iranian nationals held in the U.S. and also giving Tehran access to $6 billion of its own oil revenue that had been frozen through sanctions. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Connection lost.
events, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. First, a day of trading for Instacart. Stock now up by 22%, have been higher by as much as 40%. S&P right now down 6, little change there, down 0.1%, well off session lows. We've got the Dow down 104, down 0.3%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 10 points, a drop there of 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.35% with a 2-year that's yielding 5.09%. Spot gold down $2.50 the ounce to $19.31, a drop of 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.3%, $91.17 for a barrel of WTI. Treasury yields climbed, stocks struggled on the eve of the Fed decision, with traders betting rates will be higher for longer. Economists surveyed by Bloomberg anticipate no rate hike this time around. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The Fed is confronting a familiar nemesis, rising oil prices. Bloomberg Economics says stronger demand is responsible. Oil prices have risen by about $20 a barrel since late June. Also on the Fed's radar, slower global growth as China's economy falters. The Fed will announce its decision Wednesday. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And of course, as you have come to expect over the years, complete coverage here on Bloomberg Radio of the Fed decision. The small satellite launch company Rocket Lab, its shares down by 7% after a failed mission to space led to the loss of its primary Electron rocket and the payloads it was carrying to orbit. The rocket took off successfully from New Zealand a few minutes before 3 a.m. Wall Street time, but 2.5 minutes into the flight, the Electron rocket experienced an unspecified issue that ultimately ended the mission. Again, recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 5, a drop there of 0.1%. Instacart up 22.8%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, we've got a big deadline looming now from the UAW, the union today, Kaylee, saying Friday at high noon is the next stop in this conversation. If there's no deal by then, they start to scale up the strikes, reminding everyone that it's actually a fairly small fraction of workers that have been on the picket line here so far.
13,000 at one individual plant or factory per automaker. Right now they're focusing on highly profitable vehicles, but they have the option, Joe, to inflict more pain should they so choose.
A lot more.
And it gives them, leverage in these conversations, considering we're talking about a whole workforce of 150,000 here that could potentially join in on the strike, be walking out of work, as the 13,000 we've already seen have done.
This is something as we count down to yet another deadline, in Washington and around the country. We're joined at the table by Ian Colgren. Been looking forward to Ian's visit from Bloomberg covering the strike. In fact, you were at the picket lines in Detroit just a couple of days ago. You're literally fresh from the picket line here. What's going to happen on Friday?
Yes, certainly. Yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, I was at the Stellantis plant in Toledo, Ohio, talking to workers. I also went to the Ford plant in Wayne, Michigan, and talked to workers there. As far as what's going to happen Friday, I think it's notable that Shawn Fain gave a lot of lead time, several days, which is a long time in collective bargaining, before escalating this to additional locations, which suggests that he and the UAW is being genuine and wants some sort of solution.
But how far have they really budged in trying to work toward a solution? Sure, they dropped from 46% wage increase that they wanted to 36%, but they still want everything they want on pensions and healthcare and these other issues. So who really is moving here?
Well, no one so far, and that's the problem. That's why we have a strike, right?
Fair enough.
But and even what you mentioned, the decrease from 46 to 36, some of that are just actuarial projections, kind of. It hasn't even really been a moving of position. But what is notable is they continue to try to make the point that CEOs have gotten a 40% increase in their pay, and now they want a 40% increase as well. And to the extent that they've driven the conversation, it's been successful insofar as, you saw Mary Barra, the GM CEO, a couple days ago, get asked directly about how much money she makes on television in a really kind of uncomfortable moment. And so it is spotlighting the issues they do want to spotlight. And so the UAW really is the one driving this train for now.
Week after, they'll be meeting with Donald Trump, it seems. This is an interesting strategy for the candidate. He's skipping next week's Republican debate to go to Detroit and speak to the workers, ask for their support in the election. Sean Fain is publicly denouncing this visit, and it does seem that they're not terribly interested, or explicitly not interested, in hearing from politicians right now. Is this a smart move for Donald Trump? What will that reception be like?
Well, it's very true that most workers I talk to are not interested in hearing from politicians. They're really more interested in these so-called kitchen table issues. They're concerned about the person next to them being in a different pay tier than they are. They're worried about how they're going to be able to retire one day or in the very near future if it's an older worker. So do they want to hear from politicians? Not really. And Sean Fain has made that clear with distancing himself from the White House. But Donald Trump also knows there are a lot of individual members in the UAW and unions generally who support him. He actually increased, according to exit polls in 2020, he actually increased his share of union households from 2016 in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. Michigan fell, but overall, it was still about 40% of union members voted for Donald Trump. And he has demonstrated, unlike a lot of other issues that Trump talks about and hammers home, he really understands the nuances of this EV issue, and he understands why and how it could result in U.S. jobs being eliminated. And he wants to, and he is, sounding the alarm and sort of meeting these workers where they are and talking to them on their own terms about it.
That sounds like it could be a warm reception then, Kaylee.
Possibly. I mean, when Sean Fain was holding his live events last week in the lead up to the strike, I was monitoring the comments that happened live on their YouTube. So many of them was UAW for Trump. There was like a lot of supportive lines in there, which I thought was really interesting. But it also kind of taps into this idea of certain members of the Republican Party wanting to tap into kind of that populist aspect of it, Trump as well, but others like Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, who actually penned an op-ed today talking about how the UAW should maximize its leverage here, basically in order to disrupt the EV transition that could one day threaten these workers' jobs. In regard to the EV transition, though, Ian, that's not something that's changing. GM has, for example, made commitments to be selling electric cars by a certain date entirely. So how do they get around that issue?
Well, GM, you're correct. GM is not getting off the EV transition anytime soon. None of the big three are getting off the EV transition anytime soon. In fact, GM wants to completely eliminate gas-powered vehicles by 2035.
It's not that far away.
It's not that far away. And so the inevitability of it is something that they're going to have to address eventually, but it's also one of those things, on the other side of that coin, the inevitability also makes it kind of easier for them to harp on this, you know, because there isn't a very clear-cut solution going forward about how to preserve these jobs. There's a lot of debate into how A, to keep jobs in the country, and then B, how to keep them union jobs and how to keep the pay scale high, because right now the pay scale isn't as high for these EV plants, and that's a concern as well. It's not just disappearing jobs, it's jobs getting worse.
You start wondering if companies like Ford and GM start pushing back plans or target dates on completing that transaction as a part of whatever negotiation is going to pull out a deal here. Ian, it's great to see you. I presume you'll be back on the picket line if they
this goes
scale
on
up this weekend.
Soon enough.
It's good to see you. Thanks for your great reporting. Ian Colgren with Bloomberg covering the UAW strike. We'd love to stay in touch with Ian as we go forward here, Kaylee, because this isn't ending anytime soon.
Yep.
Latest from Detroit and back here to Washington ahead. Thanks for joining us on the fastest show in politics on the radio and on YouTube. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lines. Stay right here. This is Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Amazon says it's going to be hiring big-time 250,000 employees, 250,000 workers this holiday shopping season, and it'll be boosting average pay for logistics personnel to about $20.50 an hour as it seeks to recruit and retain workers amid a labor shortage. The hires will include full-time, part-time, and seasonal workers at hourly rates ranging from $17 to $28 an hour, depending on location. Some new hires will be eligible for bonuses ranging between $1,000 and $3,000. Amazon shares, they are down now by 2%. The UAW says more of its members will go on strike at GM, Ford, and Stellantis facilities beginning at noon on Friday unless substantial headway is made toward new labor contracts. Keith Naughton covers the automotive industry for Bloomberg News, and on surveillance this morning, he was asked what we can expect from UAW President Shawn Fain at the end of this week.
What he will likely do, if he doesn't get a deal by then, is pick 3 more factories to take down. As you know, he already has taken down a factory at each automaker, but what he hasn't done so far is taken down their most profitable factories, which are their big pickup truck factories, the F-Series for Ford and the Silverado for General Motors and the Ram for Stellantis.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio. You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington, where we'll have an update on the missing F-35. It appears they have found it. After an update on world and national news now from Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told world leaders today at the United Nations Russia is weaponizing everything from food and energy to abducted children in its war against Ukraine.
We have to stop it. We must act united to defeat the aggressor and focus all our capabilities and energy on addressing these challenges.
Zelensky says he's fighting a battle for the rule of international law and for the sovereignty of every country. Earlier today, President Biden warned they must stand up to naked aggression now, or else there will be more aggressors tomorrow. Members of the Ukrainian Defense Contact Group are gathered in Germany to discuss the status of the fighting in Ukraine. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says more U.S. equipment is coming.
The M1 Abrams tanks that the United States had previously committed to will be entering Ukraine soon.
Austin also urged leaders from other nations to continue to dig deep and to provide ground-based air defenses for Ukraine. 5 Americans are back on U.S. soil after being released yesterday by Iran as part of a prisoner swap. They landed early this morning at Fort Belvoir Army Base in Virginia. Siamak Namazi was the first off the jet. He was held for 8 years.
We take it for granted having a family together. We've been apart for 8 years, and finally we're together.
Namazi says he's grateful to be reunited with his family. 5 Iranians were released from U.S. custody as part of the deal. Iran's hardline president says the exchange could help in building trust between the two countries. Well, there's new evidence published in the journal Proceedings that working from home could cut your carbon footprint by as much as 58%. That's due to your lower power use at home and your lack of commuting. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe and Kaylee.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you. It appears they found the missing F-35. At this time yesterday, Kaylee, we didn't know where it went. This is after a Marine Corps pilot had to punch out, had to eject, and the plane was literally missing.
Yep.
Raising a lot of questions about, like, do we have transponders on these things? They thought maybe it had fallen into a lake.
Yeah.
But they found it in a field somewhere outside of the area they were looking at.
Yeah, initially, on your transponder point, a civilian spokesperson at the Bates in Charleston said they're not exactly sure what the issue with the transponder was. The bottom line was they needed the public's help to track the plane. You got to get the civilians involved. Also, Joe, we should note this pilot is safe. He's in stable condition.
That's actually, yes, absolutely.
We were also focused on the plane. We forgot the individual that was flying it, but he is okay.
I'll tell you what.
Just having a weird day.
He must be having a weird day. Can you imagine the interviews in that hotel room right now? But yeah, it came down to the tip line in the end. They told us what number it was. 843-936-3600. Hi, are you guys looking for a jet? And this is part of why the Marine Corps is actually, it's like a 2-day stand down here in flight operations. It wasn't just this jet. There was a F-18 crash, an Osprey crash, and they're wondering what is going on.
For all the mystique about, where'd the plane go? And we can, joke about it. This is actually serious. These are aircraft that individuals in the military actually operate. You need to make sure they are operating them safely. And for the F-35 program that has faced a lot of criticism, Joe, in terms of costs and just operations, it's not great optically.
Used by 3 branches of our military in countries around the world here, it does make you start to wonder, because there were a lot of problems with that jet as the program was getting started. There were oxygen problems in the cockpit. There were a lot of issues in this super sophisticated and very expensive platform. But we can tell you, they've identified the wreckage.
Yep.
It's the F-35 laying in a field.
There goes $100 million.
That's right. A rounding error at the Pentagon. Thanks for the time, Kaylee. We'll meet you back here tomorrow. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming on YouTube and on Bloomberg Originals. It's Tuesday, September 19th, 2023. I'm Tim Stenevec here. Carol Masser will be joining me shortly here in her stead. For just a few minutes, we got Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hello there, and good afternoon. We're looking at a down market right now, but I tell you, we have got a lot coming up right here on Bloomberg Business Week. Not only are we covering the markets, but also, too, we've got a conversation about the new world order, the new economic world order, what a Bloomberg economics analysis of foreign direct investment tells us about the geopolitical bets that companies are making.
Yeah, that's right. It's today's Big Take. You can read that story on the Bloomberg terminal and at bloomberg.com/thebigtake. Charlie, you mentioned that stocks are falling, bond yields are higher. This on the eve of the Federal Reserve decision. We've got higher oil prices, too. Brent topping $95 a barrel. That adds to the concern that interest rates are going to be higher for longer to prevent a flare-up of inflation. Taking a look now, tech taking a hit today. Losses from Amazon and NVIDIA, seeing those in the red. The yield on the 5 and the 10-year both hitting the highest, going all the way back to 2007. We also got on the program today, Charlie, New York Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. He's going to stop by. He's going to talk all about the state's budget, ESG, pensions, migrants. I'm even going to ask him about license plate obstruction, which is an issue that's costing New Jersey and New York about $100 million a year.
I don't know about you, Tim, but I see a lot of videos popping up, not only on YouTube, but also on Reels and also on TikTok of what some people are doing to go ahead and make their license plates undetectable. Yep. It's a huge issue because the state's losing tons of money in tolls. And then I've seen videos with these people who go around and they, quote, fix the license plates so that the numbers can be read.
Yeah, there's a video for everything. I've seen those videos, too, as well. It's not just for the tolls, but also upcoming congestion pricing and what it means for that. We got Fran Katsoudas stopping by. She's Executive Vice President and Chief People Policy Purpose Officer at Cisco Systems. She's going to talk about the business environment and the importance of ESG for driving long-term shareholder value, Charlie.
And, of course, the other big story, the other big stock story today, from the supermarket to the stock market. Tim, you know what I'm talking about.
That's right. Instacart making its public debut today. How it all went down and what it means for the future of the IPO market. Taking a look now how things are on the major indices. The Dow down 0.4%, the S&P 500 down 0.3%, the NASDAQ down as well. Coming up, we're going over to our TV team. Countdown to close starts now.
countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the countdown to the close. Romaine Bostic alongside Katie Greifeld. We're joined right now by our colleagues in the radio booth, Carol Masser and Tim Stenovic. Welcome to our audiences across.
It's just me.
Wait, what's happening?
I've got good news and bad news.
It's just Tim Stenovic.
Okay. The good news is I'm here.
Okay.
Okay. The bad news is Carol's not here.
Okay.
But she's coming here soon.
Okay, well, I know Carol, the pride of New Jersey, by the way. Did she get held up by transit issues? Because I've been reading all about New Jersey transit is just a mess, and anyone trying to get into work, was that the issue?
Fortunately, she walked. I told her to walk because New Jersey Transit has been having issues.
The reason there's a river separating us. So.
She walks on water.
There's a bridge you can get across.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
right.
you can do that.
I've heard about that.
So
a tunnel too. That I don't think you're supposed to walk.
You cannot walk in the tunnel.
Yeah.
No.
I actually saw
you bring up a good point, Romaine, because anyone who's ridden New Jersey Transit has also probably complained about New Jersey Transit. We're getting some new stats about the on-time performance rate of New Jersey Transit. It's not just you. It has been below its goal of 94.7%. It's fell to a low of 88.9%. That was back in July. The reason we're talking about this is because companies are calling workers back to the office, Katie. And if they can't get from New Jersey to New York and back, well, it's going to be hard to get to the office.
Yeah, New Jersey, it's trying its best, but did it give a reason why?
Are they?
Like, why have delays picked up? Is this a labor issue? What's going on?
No, I mean, there's some unplanned things. There are some outages. It's actually interesting that you say that because New Jersey Transit pushed back and said, if you take out Amtrak and other preventable delays from the calculations, the on-time rate was actually 94.1% in July and 95.8% in August. So, Romaine, you're laughing.
So if you remove all the things that actually affects on-time delivery, they're totally on time here.
This reminds me of like adjusted EBITDA or adjusted earnings per share,
Supercore
right?
inflation.
Yeah, it's like if you just play with these numbers and remove those one-time events, delays, then the numbers actually look okay.
Well, that folds in kind of neatly to what I want to talk about, which is earnings, because over the past few seasons, companies have been talking about inflation, they've been talking about recession, but Bloomberg actually crunched the numbers. There's a new word that companies have been warning about on earnings calls. It's geopolitics. Apparently, if you look into it, S&P 500 chief executives have used the word geopolitics almost 12,000 times this year. That is almost 3 times as much as they did just 2 years ago, and it really tells you a lot about the global economy right now.
Yeah, I guess this isn't surprising. Given all the ructions, of course, with the relationship between the U.S. and China, the potential rise of India, the war in Ukraine with Russia, and of course, whatever the heck is going on with Taiwan, North Korea, and some of the other states here that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I guess the big question is to what extent is this like a new world economic order? It's the big take. It's what we're focusing on in the first part of our show today as well, guys. Bloomberg Economics crunched the numbers and found that of the $1.2 trillion in greenfield foreign direct investment invested in 2022, close to $180 billion shifted across geopolitical blocs from countries that declined to condemn Russia's invasion to those that did, according to the analysis. So does that stick? And also, how porous is that?
And we'll also see, we talk so much about supply chains, onshoring, friendshoring. It just feels like there's a lot of fundamental shifts that are going on in the economy right now. And Tim, to your point, how sticky is this? Once you start to shift your supply chain, it's pretty hard to undo that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see how long this continues, right? Then the next earnings season, which is just around the corner, do we actually see go from 12,000 mentions or whatever you said, Katie, to, I don't know, something higher?
1 million?
Maybe
that
just
would be something.
Adjusted EBITDA all over again. That's what we're going to be focusing on, community adjusted EBITDA. Guys, that's going to do it for now. When I come back, Carol's going to be back here with me. So don't worry.
You promise?
Yeah, I promise. We'll be back again live on TV, radio, and YouTube on Bloomberg Quick Take, 4 p.m. for our Beyond the Bell coverage. We're going to take you through today's market close. $30 minutes later, we're going to hear from the man himself. It's the 6th meeting of the Federal Reserve's Policy Setting Committee. We're going to have all the U.S. Central Bank's latest view on economic projections on the U.S. economy. Is it going to be a snoozer, or might there be some possible fireworks? With his view, back with us, we got Dr. Stephen Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at Keelpoint, also a former U.S. Treasury and White House National Security Council staff member, joining us on Zoom from Washington, D.C. Also with us, Anna Wong, Chief U.S. Economist for Bloomberg Economics, on Zoom from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Dr. Skanke, good to have you with us. It's a good day to talk to both of you, especially ahead of hearing from Fed Chair Jay Powell tomorrow, the committee meeting today, of course. What's top of mind for them, do you think, Dr. Skanke?
Well, they're still trying to figure out whether inflation had just taken a break and is now going to rebound. Certainly, they're concerned about the high oil and energy price numbers and what that's doing in gasoline on the headline and how that translates through to core inflation. So that's certainly a concern. The other concern is that the economy still seems to be growing pretty robustly. For all the reasons that we think consumer spending should be slowing, the latest numbers last week didn't show that at all. And that's got to be a concern for them.
I want to bring in Anna Wong, but first, speaking of headlines, the Treasury 10-year yield rising to 4.365%, the highest going all the way back to 2007. Anna Wong is Chief U.S. Economist for Bloomberg Economics. Anna, you've got a great piece out about why a soft landing call always precedes recessions. Take us into the history there and also why, you think it's a little too early for people to declare a soft landing this time around.
Yeah, so, we have seen 4 recessions in the past, say, since 1990. And preceding each of those 4 recessions, there had been a chorus of soft landing optimism. So you could actually look up the word soft landing across news headline, and it's very clear that that's the trend. And so in that piece, we ask, what is the reason for why soft landing hopes always peak right before recession? I think there are a couple of reasons. Number one is that economists' forecasting tools tend to depend on linear relationships. Unfortunately, unemployment does not follow a linear distribution, data generating process. In fact, during recessions, unemployment tends to jump in a non-linear way. So as a result, when people think linearly, the mean forecast would suggest that unemployment rate would only, slightly rise to 3.9% by the end of this year. And that might be the number that the Fed officials, the median participant, would write in the updated SEP tomorrow, 3.9% unemployment by the end of this year. That is entirely consistent with a linear way of thinking about the world. But if you think about the risk and we calculated the risk around that mean forecast using historical data, in fact, it shows you that the upside risk for unemployment is actually much, much bigger than the downside risk to unemployment. So this is why we think overall that there's still substantial risk of a recession before the end of the year.
Dr. Skanke, weigh in on that. Do you agree with Anna Wong that there's substantial risk of a U.S. recession by the end of the year?
Well, I certainly agree with Anna's research and analytics on this. And yes, there is a risk of recession before the end of the year. I happen to think that it's more likely to bleed into 2024 than necessarily show up here. But there are a lot. I mean, we know that there's a lot of things that are going to be happening in October and November that could very quickly push consumer spending down. Other things on the trade front, business investment, certainly, Tim, as you mentioned, the record high 10-year Treasury. How does that affect the psychology of business investing? And so several things could all of a sudden start to spook decision makers, and we end up with not only a weakening, but even possibly a negative GDP growth by the end of the fourth quarter. The other thing is money supply has been in a negative growth period for now over a year. And historically, that correlates very highly with recession. That would, if you sort of try to time it out, look more into early 2024 than at the end of 2023. But even that historically has not been tightly timed at 18 months. So that's another factor out there that we don't talk about very much, but still a very real factor in how this thing could turn quickly.
So, Dr. Wong, tell us how you think the Fed is going to handle, talking about the uncertainties that have come up over the last few months here. The fact that the 10-year has risen so much, the concerns that you raised about unemployment. Talk to me about how you think the Fed deals with this with regard to how it's thinking about its interest rate path and potentially cutting in 24.
Yeah. So, Chairman Powell has already told us very clearly how he deals with uncertainty at the Jackson Hole speech. He said that when there's uncertainty and when there's still some of lags of monetary policy operating in the background, he would move slowly. And uncertainty is what we are going to have in the next couple of months. As Steve said, we have, UAW strike ongoing right now. We still have that Hollywood strike. We have a potential government shutdown looming that if it lasts for a month, we expect that it will raise unemployment rate by 0.2 percentage point, and at which point the Psalms rule for kickstarting a recession would be triggered. So I think that Powell would definitely perceive all these risks as telling him that they should wait for more information. So I think it's unlikely that the Fed will raise rate in November. However, it might be that he will be holding out the door open for a December hike or even January hike.
A January hike. So much of our conversation over the last few weeks has focused on November. Dr. Skanke, what's your impression here? Do you think we'll see a
Well, I agree with what Anna said. I don't think that the Fed is going to raise rates when they announce tomorrow. But I do think that Chair Powell will qualify the decision not to raise rates in his remarks by saying something like rate hikes can resume if needed. I think the hold will also have some other hawkish elements or hawkish connotations in the dot plot. They might even show the possibility of another rate hike, if not in November, in December. Could happen early in January. So the dot plot and the updated summary of economic projections will be important and very interesting. For example, to see if they ratify the notion that the GDP is still growing steadily, albeit maybe a little bit weaker than the 2% path that we're on right now. And how do they factor in higher oil prices when they look at PCE inflation? And what do they say about unemployment? Yes, again, as Anna said, unemployment does not increase linearly, and they've been more hawkish on that. So it'll be very interesting. What we see in the dot plot and the SEP will probably be way more interesting than what they say about not raising rates.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I'm looking forward to the SEP, but also, of course, the press conference as well. Dr. Wong, tell us if you could ask Jay Powell one question tomorrow, what would it be?
I would ask him whether he thinks that the strikes is suggesting that maybe inflation expectations are not as anchored as it seemed. I mean, we have already seen central bank officials in other countries, such as Reserve Bank of Australia, suggesting that inflation expectations may not be anchored given that union workers are able to demand higher wages. And we're seeing exactly that happening in the U.S.
Wait, how do oil prices and gas prices factor into inflation expectations, Anna?
Well, it's like a chicken and egg problem. From the Fed's perspective, if they believe that inflation expectations are anchored, they will look through the increase in oil prices. But if they don't believe that it's very anchored, they won't look through it. So I think the inflation expectations question is really the core of what they will do.
Dr. Skanke, 10 seconds, one question that you would ask Jay Powell tomorrow.
What's the trigger point for deciding that rates need to be increased again, either in November or December?
All right, there it is. Really appreciate both of you joining us this afternoon, the eve before we hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell tomorrow. That's Dr. Stephen Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at Keel Point, former U.S. Treasury and White House National Security Council staff member. Also, Dr. Anna Wong, Chief U.S. Economist for Bloomberg Economics.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got stocks lower across the board 39 minutes to go ahead of the bell. And this update brought to you by Glenn Mead. Glenn Mead offers sophisticated wealth and investment management solutions combined with a personalized service you deserve. Your wealth, your mission, your investments. Let's talk. Visit glennmead.com to learn more. Bond yields rose, stocks fell on the eve of the Fed decision. Traders betting rates will be higher for longer to curb inflation. The S&P down 16 now, a drop of 0.4%. The Dow down 160 points, lower by 0.5%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 55, a decline of 0.4%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.36% with the 2-year now at 5.10% on the 2-year, 5.10%. Spot gold down $2 the ounce to $19.31, down 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude 91.44 a barrel. Brent 94.48 barrel of Brent, up by less than 0.1%. So Fed policymakers are in the first day of a 2-day meeting. The Fed decision and news conference coming tomorrow. But what about the economic outlook? Specifically calls for a recession. Stephen Skanke is Chief Economic Advisor at Keel Point, and he was a guest moments ago right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
There is a risk of recession before the end of the year. I happen to think that it's more likely to bleed into 2024 than necessarily show up here. But there are a lot. I mean, we know that there's a lot of things that are going to be happening in October and November that could very quickly push consumer spending down. Other things on the trade front, business investment.
And you can hear more of the conversation with Stephen Skanke on the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Briefly, new data shows home construction dropped to the lowest level since June of 2020. Little change among the home builders. Lennar unchanged right now. KB Home up 0.3%. It reports tomorrow. And Toll Brothers down 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Really appreciate it. Well, over the last year, Carol and I have talked a lot about what seems like a new economic world order emerging. In the wake of the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're starting to see corporations picking sides when it comes to their capital. Up to now, though, a lot of the discussion that we've had has just been based on anecdotes. That's changed, though, with today's Big Take. It's a deep dive of foreign direct investment and also what we're hearing on earnings calls from some of the biggest companies in the world. Western multinationals for years have avoided geopolitics in favor of pursuing profits in less mature markets. Well, now they're increasingly building the factories of the future in like-minded nations. It's the subject of today's Big Take, written by Sean Donnan and Enda Curran. Sean Donnan is senior economics writer for Bloomberg News. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. You can read Sean's story and more from Bloomberg, The Big Take, on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Sean, good to have you back with us. Congratulations on today's Big Take. I just want to start with the data, because up to now, so much of what we've based our observations on has been anecdotal. So what data did you find to actually prove this?
No, that's absolutely right. We've been hearing for a long time. You can go back a decade and hear people talk about shifting supply chains and the end of globalization. So it's never been borne out in the data. And what we've seen and what we looked at is foreign direct investment data, in particular greenfield foreign direct investment data. That's just a fancy way of saying where companies are putting their new factories. And what we see is very clearly that Western companies in particular are putting their new factories not in China, not in a lot of emerging economies, but closer to home and in other Western economies, in particular, in other like-minded nations. We found, and this is my colleague Maeva Cousin, who's a economist with Bloomberg Economics, and did really the hard data analysis here. And what she found is there's $180 billion in capital that essentially shifted from one block, and if you think of a kind of broad China-led block of emerging economies, to a kind of Western U.S.-led economy, and that was just last year, which is a remarkable amount, and really for the first time puts some dollars and cents on a trend that we've all been hearing about. And that's kind of been aspirational for people like Joe Biden and Janet Yellen's talked about friendshoring and so on. But really, here's the hard data.
Where are the borders emerging right now? Because in the piece, you talk a lot about the 2023 UN vote calling for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. How is this playing out economically? Like, which countries in the big picture voted to condemn Russia? Which ones voted not to condemn Russia? Or which ones are kind of trying to do, play it both ways?
Play it both ways, and that's a very important point. That last point. Just to start with the first two, there's about 140 countries in the world that voted first last year and then earlier this year to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the UN General Assembly. And there's about 40 or so countries that voted to abstain, and then there's 6 or 7, 8 countries that voted just no against a resolution to condemn Russia. What we did, and what we're really trying to understand here is the role that geopolitics has played in the kind of allocation of capital by companies. And what we did is we used these votes at the United Nations to kind of define our blocks in the world. Now, they're imperfect. The break between the blocks is not clean because there are big countries like India, important trading countries like Vietnam that voted to abstain on this vote. But essentially, this is the kind of geopolitical divide in our world. And what we see is capital kind of flowing within these blocks, and that's new. And we didn't just pluck this method out of the air. This is increasingly how economists at the International Monetary Fund and elsewhere are starting to look at the world as they try to figure out what this kind of new geopolitical era is doing to the global economy.
But it's not a perfect way to measure things, though, by any means. And you guys make that clear in the piece. I just want to bring up something that happened today. President Biden delivering remarks at the UN General Assembly meeting. He said that the U.S. is for de-risking with China, not decoupling from China. Tell us about the data that you and the team found about a lack of investment from the U.S. and from Europe and even other Asian countries into China over the last couple of years, and to what extent it represents a decoupling versus a de-risking.
Yeah, so what's important here is that the data that we are looking at is investment in the factories of the future, right? So that doesn't tell you about the current relationship. And we all know that the U.S. has a really important or large trading relationship with China, and that a lot of Western companies have been invested in China for many years. And that remains the case. And that is a little bit what Joe Biden is reflecting when he talks about de-risking versus decoupling. The administration has talked about a small yard with a high fence when it's talked about some of its the economic, the export controls in particular in terms of the restrictions on technology exports in particular to China. It's very keen, and we saw this with Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary's visit to China
really interesting
early this year. We're still, the United States and U.S. companies are still keen to sell to China, and Chinese companies are still keen to sell to the United States. That's not going to change. That's not going to change. But what we are seeing is these factories of the future and where they're lining up. And that is a kind of diversification in the short term. And it may, if this continues down the line, this is where you get a kind of harder decoupling rather than the de-risking that you're talking about. I mean, this is still, this stuff moves slowly, right? We like to think.
You said that we've been talking about this for a decade, and we've been hearing about it for a decade.
Absolutely, and so those factories are going to take a couple of years to build. The trade flows will follow them. We will see more factories built in the future. We may see a huge charm campaign and a change in Chinese policy that means that Western companies are attracted there again at some point. It seems unlikely right now, but that may change. So this is absolutely not a perfect analysis. And that's partly because we live in a world where economists now are trying to get their head around something that's pretty amorphous, and that is geopolitics, and who is your friend and who isn't, and how that changes, and how that drives capital flows versus simply the pure chasing of profits and costs and all of those kind of hard data points that CEOs used to use when they looked at where to build their factories.
Okay, Sean, so many more questions. I think I only have time for one, though. The U.S., where does it leave the U.S. in terms of being a winner or a loser here? Just in 1 minute.
Yeah, in 1 minute, we know that the Biden administration has invested hugely in bringing strategic industries back to the United States. We've seen a big boom in terms of manufacturing in the United States, a lot of European companies investing here. The U.S. seems to be a winner in the short term. What folks at the IMF and elsewhere warn you, though, is that in the long term, any kind of fragmentation in the global economy is bad for everyone and will be bad for the U.S. as well.
Yeah, the fine print there. Okay, real quick, if the war in Ukraine gets resolved somehow, how does this change?
That's a really good question. I don't think that we're going to see a repairing of the relationship between Russia and the West very quickly. So that's going to affect that. And I think China is going to be left with some scars and some suspicions, just as the U.S. is. And it's not just the war in Ukraine. It's also about the pandemic and all the stuff that we're trying to get our head around after that.
It's just a fantastic piece from you and the team. Sean Donnan, the global economy enters an era of upheaval. It's today's Big Take. Check it out at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Now to world and national news in Washington, D.C. Here's Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Tim. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on UN nations to act now to defeat Russian aggression.
The goal of the present war against Ukraine is to turn our land, our people, our lives, our resources into a weapon against you, against the international rules-based order.
President Biden had a similar message when he spoke at the UN earlier. He told members no nation is secure if Ukraine's land is stolen.
If you allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? I'd respectfully suggest the answer is no. We have to stand up to this naked aggression today and deter other would-be aggressors tomorrow.
Biden's message of unwavering support for Ukraine is playing out as Congress is increasingly divided over providing additional funding. Ukraine's president will be traveling to Washington later this week to seek additional aid from Congress. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is not likely to offer a sympathetic ear.
Is Zelensky elected to Congress? Is he our president? I don't think I have to commit anything. I have questions for him. Where's the accountability on the money we already spent? What is the plan for victory?
McCarthy's words are not being mimicked by his party in the Senate, though. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says Ukraine is deserving of additional aid, and the money already allocated has been seen unprecedented oversight. 5 Americans freed from Iranian captivity are now back in the U.S. They were greeted at a Virginia Army base early this morning by Special Presidential Envoy Roger Carstens.
On behalf of the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, it's an honor to be the first to welcome you back to the United States of America and to freedom.
Again, that's Roger Carstens. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. Red on the screen, 20 minutes to go ahead of the closing bell. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. Let us head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlotte. U.S. stocks trading in the red today, helped by a hotter than expected Canadian CPI number. Dow's currently down 120 points. S&P's drop 11, and NASDAQ is off by 38. The U.S. 10-year yield at 4.365%. That's the highest level since 2007. Gold is down 3. Oil is now little changed, and Bitcoin is higher by 1.4%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, only healthcare was in the green, and leaders to the upside in the Dow, IBM and Apple. While Disney fell 3%, on a report they're going to double their parks investment to $60 billion. In other news, Amazon hired 250,000 employees for the holidays, and wrapping things up, AutoZone fell after earnings. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type SQUAWK, S-Q-U-A, on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. Who's gonna drive you home? Honey, please, I'll do the driving. Drive on. Excuse me, I want to drive. It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody. Carol Master along with Jim Stanovic.
Who is that?
Yeah, I just kind
Who
of
is
slid
that?
in. We're going to talk about more of what I was doing later on. We were at the Earthshot Prize and the Bloomberg Innovation Summit here at the Plaza in New York City. But it's all about innovators who are doing very cool things. A lot of it is about how can we improve the climate.
I'm sorry I missed
and
it.
reduce the carbon footprint.
I'm sorry I missed it. I'm glad you're
Prince
back.
William was a little ticked off.
Did you tell him I said hi?
I will.
Okay. But I was holding down the fort. Don't worry.
He did talk about, though, this Treasury 10-year yield rising to 4.365%, highest since 2007. He did not. But nonetheless, we are talking about it. We want to see what Charles Tan has to say, because this is definitely in his wheelhouse. He's co-CIO of Global Fixed Income at American Century Investments. He's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, and he's been watching how the sausage is made. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
10-year. 5-year, we've seen the highest yield since 2007. Right. Significant?
Absolutely, yeah. So, over the past couple of years, I think some of the major changes in the global economy and also global financial markets are leading to this higher inflation and, not surprisingly, higher rates environment. And, we think, having said that, we feel like, tomorrow is a Fed meeting, right? So that could well be the end of this, hiking cycle. We are expecting what's so-called about like a hawkish, pause tomorrow, meaning that, they will pause, but they will...
You read the Bloomberg story that said hawkish pause, did you?
Okay. Yeah, that's actually been sort of the market consensus for a while. So, and we're definitely going along with the market consensus on this one. But going to pause and they're going to sound hawkish. So there still might be a chance of a hike in November. But we believe by the time when November comes around, economic data will be weak enough for them to say this is it.
Okay, I'm going to just throw this out there. I'm going to get a little crazy, okay? I was walking in the office yesterday, and we're to that point in the economic cycle where a colleague of mine who, doesn't, he stops me, knows what I do for work, and he's like, I want to talk to you about bonds. And he's like, he's close to retirement. He's like, why would I not buy 2-year bonds that yield over 5% right now? He's like, I've ignored bonds for years.
Right.
Why would I not do that right now? And I said, first of all, I can't provide investment advice, friend. I have no idea, but I'll ask Charles all about it.
Well, I would say, your colleague is definitely on the right path, because, this is it's the very first time in multiple years, actually, investors and savers, if you're retiring, they're thinking about savings,
are actually getting a really, attractive yield, right? So you talk about a 5%, you can put your money in the money market, don't worry about it, or you can put your money in buying treasury bills, 5%, that's it, you feel pretty good about it. If you're willing to take a little bit more risk, let's say, we actually recently launched a new product called FUSI. It's an ETF, floating rate, instrument. A little bit more risk, AA rated, in the bond world, highest is AAA, double A, single A, then high yield, those kind of things. So double A average is very high quality.
So is this corporate?
This is a corporate structured and also floating rate mortgage bond.
Okay.
Altogether, floating rates, you don't take any risk.
Right.
On the floating rate interest rates, you take a little bit credit risk, you get a 7%. Then if you're a little bit more adventurous, you can go into high yield bank loans, you can get 8 to 10%, right? So there's a far cry from merely like a year and a half, 2 years ago, right? If you compare bonds today versus the stocks, it's also the polar opposite. 2 years ago, I think, bond yield, as we know, was almost zero. And, stock dividend yield was about 2% and earnings yield about 5%. Today, bond yield is about 5 to 6%, 7%. You can take a bit more risk. But where is dividend yield? 1.5%. And where is earnings yield? It's only 4%. Right. So that's why you're seeing a lot of flows into money market funds, into short duration funds. And I think your friend is really having his mind in the right place.
But that's interesting. Talk to us about where the investment money is going. Is it all short duration at this point?
I think so far, the flow, the vast majority of flow are going into the short end, money market funds in particular, which is at a historical
Which is really
high,
short, yeah.
Right? But we also believe there are opportunities now with the Fed, almost at the end of the hiking cycle. The 10-year, you just mentioned about a 4.36%.
Yeah.
We think it looks attractive. The reason we think it's attractive is because, when you have a recession, when you have economic slowdown, when inflation comes down, interest rates tend to decline, right? When that declines, then you can, add, sort of more duration to your portfolio by buying not only front end, but also, 5-year bond, 7-year bond, 10-year bond.
But investors aren't doing that yet.
Not yet, because
is it because they don't know if the hiking cycle's done?
I
or
think
if there's more room to run on yields?
I think there is anxiety about, the sort of when the hiking cycle will be down and what that means for.
I think that's an understatement.
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I honestly, I think the whole
anxiety in all caps, exclamation point,
right.
exclamation point.
The whole world is debating on, this is inflation really turning, or is going to be actually reviving at a certain point?
But to that point, fundamentally, it's interesting coming from the Earthshot Innovation Summit that we do here at Bloomberg. It's all about reducing the carbon footprint, but we are in this interesting cycle where it feels like more companies are getting more aggressive about their ESG aspects and reducing their carbon footprint. I mean, hottest year on record already here globally. So I do wonder if those shifts, some of those things that are out there, does it mean that the inflation picture is higher than it's been? And do we need to accept that?
Yeah, I think you're...
Even if the Fed will not.
That's right. So I think that this inflation sort of a trend is a very complicated question, as it should be. The way we look at it is this, we think that inflation in the near term, call it 1 to 2 years, is going to be going down. But then over a 3 to 5 year time horizon, it may well come back. So this is what we call cyclically, down, but secularly up. Why we think that's the case?
Yeah.
Near term, 1 to 2 years, in that time horizon, we believe there's going to be a hard landing. There will be a recession. And in the recession, demand will go down and the supply will naturally go up. And, the trend of inflation naturally will go down in that time horizon. Another factor really is money supply. I'm sure over the past 2 or 3 years, there's a huge money supply, right? So now money supply. And
we're going to talk about with the New York State Comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli. Like the last 3 years, it's been great for state cities.
That's right.
Right? They've been able to cut taxes because there's been so much money coming in. Very different environment today.
Exactly. So, M2 right now is contracting, which is supporting sort of the inflation will be down at least for the next couple of years. But then longer term, we believe there are many structural sort of changes in the global economy, including ESG, energies, lack of energy, sort of the investment. But there are other forces at work as well that will push inflation up secularly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Great to get some time with you. Thank you. And thank you for dealing with our craziness before we went on air. Get a little idea of behind the scenes. Charles Tan, he's co-CIO of Global Fixed Income over at American Century Investments here in studio.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger is making the case that the company's technology will be vital to an industry-wide boom in artificial intelligence computing. Speaking at Intel's annual innovation conference, Gelsinger pointed to advances that his company is making in production technology and software developer tools for AI. He says the opportunity will only grow as more artificial intelligence capabilities are powered by personal computers. Starbucks shares are trading lower right now. We've got Starbucks down 1.5%. This after TD Cowen downgraded the coffee chain to market perform from outperform. And with more on the Starbucks story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, TD Cowen is flagging worrisome macroeconomic and competitive pressures that the broker expects to challenge same-store sales in China. Analysts led by Andrew Charles lowered estimates for same-store sales in China for fiscal year 2024-2025, noting that low-priced competition is gaining share with aggressive discounts likely to persist for the next 2+ years. They also cite macro headwinds that, quote, bode poorly for consumer spending. Charlie.
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting. Amazon says it will hire 250,000 employees this holiday shopping season and boost average pay for logistics personnel to about $20.50 an hour as it seeks to recruit and retain workers amid a labor shortage. Amazon shares right now are trading down by 1.6%. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we've got just about 4.5 minutes left. Tick tock, tick tock.
Well, time flies when you're having fun, right?
Hey, it's like FOMC Eve.
And we're going to be here for the FOMC meeting tomorrow, too.
Less than 24 hours from now, we will know what the Fed thinks about the U.S. economy.
Have you ever been to the American Dream Mall in New Jersey?
No, and, you know, I live in New Jersey. I'm proud of it. We are known for our malls.
Have you ever driven by the American Dream Mall in New Jersey?
I think I have driven by it.
I'm sure you have. Everybody's driven by it. Not all who drive by it stop. And maybe that's the problem.
I know people have gone and taken their kids and it's a blast.
Oh, it is cool, Carol.
Wait, have you gone?
Yeah, I've gone.
No.
Oh, yeah. You know why we went?
Why?
I could take Arlo skiing any time of the year.
Was
it's a
it
great
fun?
place. It was so fun.
Seriously?
Indoor skiing, okay?
I love that.
Year round. A great place to learn how to ski. They provide everything for you. It's free for kids.
You didn't turn to dust when you turned to New Jersey?
No. It took us a long time to get there. I'm not going to lie. We had to bring supplies with us. You know.
What do you mean?
I'm just kidding.
Okay.
But you know, it was really cool. And what I noticed about the place was that yes, there are a lot of high-end stores.
Yes.
But it's also very experiential, right? It's that conversation we were having back in 2019 before the pandemic. What can you provide to people with an in-store experience that you can't provide them online?
Indoor ski slope, as you said, amusement park, water park. Sounds like, how could anything go wrong?
Here's the bad news.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bloomberg Business Week has written about this a lot.
Yeah, the mega mall has seen its losses increase fourfold in just 1 year. That's according to a draft securities filing.
Yeah, $245 million in 2022 as expenses almost doubled to $428 million, according to this 3-page document. It was posted yesterday to the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board's EMM or EMMA website. Financial expenses, which typically include debt service payments, ballooned to $189 million. This has been, though, American Dream, the mall, has gone through several different iterations, and it just seems not able to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, Nuveen LLC is American Dream's biggest municipal bondholder. They got $600 million of the $800 million payment in lieu of tax bonds as of July 31st. We should note a Nuveen spokesperson declined to comment. Can they make it work?
I don't know.
That's the question.
Tim, maybe you have to take Arlo more there.
I know. Maybe they should. Maybe they should
visit.
include skiing free for a kid with the purchase of an adult ticket. It was a great deal. Great place to learn how to ski.
Oh my God, New Jersey! It's really a wonderful place, but I gotta say, the American Dream moment, it's been having a hard time. All right, folks, just a few minutes left in trading. It's time to head over to our TV colleagues. Beyond the Bell starts right now.
Beyond.
Now, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic alongside Scarlett Fu. We're counting you down to the closing bell. We're here to help take us beyond the bell. It's a global simulcast with our friend Tim Stenevec. Welcome to our audiences across our Bloomberg platforms, television, radio, as well as those folks streaming on YouTube.
Carol's here too, I promise. She's here.
I hear like the disembodied voice of somebody, but there she is. Oh, wait, she gets her own box? Wow. Wow.
Really
the star of this show.
She was not stuck on New Jersey Transit. She was not at the American Dream Mall.
Well, I was solving climate change over at the Plaza with the Earthshot Prize and Bloomberg Philanthropies. You guid what'd you do to the Treasury market here, guys?
Yeah, blame it on Romaine.
I am going to blame it. Look at the 10-year.
This is, well, yeah, but this is that
5-year.
reassessment I think a lot of people are making right now about just how much further rates have to go. Remember, this isn't just about the Fed anymore. This goes beyond monetary policy. It's about economic conditions.
Well, we just had a guest on too, right, who says, wait, you look at what the 10-year yields and you look at what the S&P 500 with a yield of about 1.5%. Like, you start to say, wait a minute, it makes increasingly more sense, Tim, to put money in the Treasury trade.
Yeah, and look, you know, that was Charles Tan, the co-CIO over of Global fixed income at American Century Investments, Scarlett. But I have to tell you, there's also been a change in tone that I've noticed over the past couple of weeks, and especially today. Team Soft Landing has really seemed to be winning this, but this new note from Anna Wong over at Bloomberg Economics, there's a lot of pessimism out there right now.
Well, can I just on that point though? They also put out a note, her and one of her deputies, saying that the last 4 recessions have all been preceded by this drumbeat of soft landing.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you saw the same thing.
Territory.
Yeah, interesting report. If you have a Bloomberg terminal, I definitely urge you to check it out. The data that they put, kind of sobering here, given how much we talk about, we might actually be out of the woods.
We're all inclined to believe that a soft landing is in the cards.
Yeah, absolutely here. On this Tuesday afternoon, market's still in a bit of a holding pattern. Fractional losses across the board, with the Dow down about 0.3%. The S&P and the NASDAQ each down about 0.2%, while the Russell 2000 is going to finish the day lower, Carol Masser, if you are actually there, down 0.4.
I'm still hurting from that $3. I'm just going to say, I'm a sensitive little gal. Hey, S&P 500, by the way, about 199 names to the upside, guys, 302 to the downside. So we definitely are seeing more of a negative tone, but, we're all kind of waiting for the Fed decision tomorrow.
Yeah, the negative tone is really reflected in the sector performances too. If you pull up the 24 industry groups of the S&P 500, let's start on the decliners. Retailers off by 1.25%. You've got chip companies losing about 0.9%. Energy stocks down 0.8%, even though oil prices remain somewhat high at new 15-month highs. Keep in mind, energy was the best performer over the last 3 months. On the upside, those that are bucking the decline, insurance companies, autos, and tech hardware are each up by at least 0.5%.
All right, interesting. All right, so that's your big look at the markets, the big major industry groups. Enphase Energy, let's get to some of the individual gainers. It's number 1 in the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 100 today. It's up about 4.2%. After the close yesterday, news that company director Thurman Rogers reported a series of insider stock transactions. He reported that to the SEC. It's about $4 million worth. Stock, keep in mind, is down about 10% over the past month. It's down more than 50% year to date. 8% of the float is shorted, but nonetheless, news of that insider buying certainly sending that one as a top gainer in today's trade. Also want to go to the cruise lines. Both Royal Caribbean and Carnival getting some upgrades. Royal Carib upgraded to buy, Carnival lifted to hold at Truist Securities. They are citing strong trends and cooled off stocks. So you had Royal Caribbean up about 2.5% in today's trade, and Carnival was up 3.6% at its highs, but finishing with about a 1/3 gain. And this is for you, Romaine. Rackspace Technology.
Yeah,
it's a small cap, about $425 million.
I love small cap.
I know you do. About 36% higher in today's trade. Notable move. This is after Raymond James did an upgrade. It's an infrastructure software company, upgrading to outperform from market performance, saying its turnaround plan is gaining traction. Price target set to a street high of $3.50. Stock closing at about $2.
And we should just point out too, of course, keeping an eye on Instacart. Those shares at one point up 43% on the day.
Oh, I missed that one.
Closing right now. You did miss it, but that's okay. Up 12%.
That's what happens when you keep me out of the 4 box. I'm just telling you.
No Instacart.
Retribution.
Carol's got the gainers. I got the decliners. Let's take a look at what happened with Amazon today. Should note that higher bond yields hitting tech shares. We saw the mega caps all move lower today. Many of them, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet. Amazon among the worst performers on a points basis, the worst performer in the S&P 500 on a points basis, finishing the day down by 1.6%. The company did say a little later in the session that it would hire 250,000 employees this holiday shopping season. It's going to boost average pay for those logistics personnel to about $20.50 an hour. The company is still dealing with attracting and retaining talent in this environment. Let's also take a look at shares of Walt Disney. Early this morning in a filing, shares have been down all day. It finished the day down 3.6%. Early this morning in a filing, the company coming out and saying that it's going to nearly double its investment in parks and resorts to $60 billion over the next 10 years. The company said it's seen increased profits from investing in these parks, cruises, ships, and other attractions tied to its movies and characters. Disney said it's seen record growth in customer spending at the parks over the past 2 years and a significant decrease in the number of tickets it sells at a discount compared with before the pandemic. It's also gotten pretty expensive to go to those parks.
Gotten pretty expensive?
Yeah,
it's been expensive for a long time.
Very expensive.
Well worth it. Had fun.
Here's
but
a small
man.
cap. Rocket Lab, finishing the day lower today by 7.5%. It's a small satellite launch company. Overnight, about 3 a.m. New York time, launched from New Zealand. A failed mission It led to a loss of its primary Electron rocket and the payloads that it was carrying into orbit. Shares were down as much as 15% earlier in the session, finishing down by 7.5%, Romain.
Let's take a quick look at yields here, because that was where a great deal of the price action was here on this day. You saw the entire curve, yield curve, shifting a little bit higher on the day, with the biggest activity in the 5-year and the 10-year space, each up about 6 to 7 basis points. In fact, right now you have a 2-year yield at the highest level since 2006, a 5-year yield at the highest level since 2007, and a 10-year yield also at the highest level since 2007 here. But that's what the market is staring into, and that's what the Fed is going to have to stare back into as it makes a decision tomorrow about what to telegraph to this market. Does it give them some sense here that mission is accomplished, or at least on its way being accomplished, or do they try to jawbone the market into believing that the Fed might still hike again?
There's no indication that they're going to say mission accomplished. I think everyone's learned the downside of doing just that. But if the message is higher for longer, that's what they've been saying for a while now. Why today is that resonating in a different way?
I don't know. You know what I keep thinking about? These yields at 2007, 2008 was a very different environment. I'm not saying that there aren't stresses today, but it's like I'm trying to make sense of the comparison. They're not the same situation. So what is it kind of behind it? I just want to say to Scarlett to try to answer her question, though, but a lot of this is kind of sort of being disconnected from the Fed. That a lot of folks we're talking to are saying that when you look at, we're looking at it from the yield perspective, but you have to kind of look at the flip side, which is the price perspective. And the idea that if economic conditions are deteriorating, like some people believe here, why would you want to hold 10-year duration or 20-year duration?
Right. You have no visibility into what's to come. And we know that inflation, the easy work's been done on inflation, right? The disinflation trend, most of it's been done at this point. It's going to be harder. The comparisons are a lot harder, too.
And some people would argue that it was no work at all, that a lot of sort of the downdraft in inflation had less to do with the Fed policy and more just to do with some of those, I guess, transitory issues that we all sort of laughed at.
So Powell's kind of right.
But there's a lot of things happening right now in the environment that Powell has no control over, and also indications that the labor market is still really strong. I was surprised to read in our write-up of the Amazon news with 250,000 employees being hired during the holiday shopping season. That's more than hired last year, more than hired back in 2019.
How much are they paying them, Tim?
$20.50 an hour.
Okay.
So, and it's still having trouble. The company's still having trouble attracting and retaining talent. So that's not indicating to me that there is a problem in the labor market to the extent that, that people are concerned about job losses. It's still hard to attract and retain talent in this environment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I keep having a lot of conversations with people who are like, I can't find enough workers. In the construction business and contracting, that is still a lot of stress points.
So that's kind of scary from an inflation perspective. I mean, the UAW's out there, making these demands for a 4-day work week and other demands too. Workers feel like they have power still.
I feel like I have power. I got my box back.
Yeah, Carol. I mean, she does. I mean, like I said, she just works half a day.
She showed up halfway through the show.
If only everyone could just get a box,
I mean,
that would be
these 4 people on the screen, we know who has the real power here. It's Barbie there.
Hey, listen, Barbie.
It's because of the Barbie pink. That's why.
You got pink there.
Barbie's pretty powerful. Ken is the one who's not so powerful. I'm just gonna say. All right, guys.
I feel sorry for Ken.
Do you really?
Not really.
I think he feels sorry for himself, too.
All right, guys, that's a wrap. We're going to see you guys tomorrow, and we'll have a Fed decision, which will be really exciting. All right, that's our cross-platform coverage, radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals, Beyond the Bell, and Countdown to the Close. We'll see you tomorrow. General Assembly. It comes against a backdrop of war on Europe's doorstep, catastrophic floods, turning climate change from a future risk to a present danger. There's no shortage of pressing challenges for world leaders assembling to address, and they have been addressing them big time.
Our next guest notes that although Chinese President Xi Jinping will not be attending this year's General Assembly, it's unlikely to undermine China's influence in the world's most important international governance body. Very pleased to have with us this afternoon Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst Jennifer Welch. She joins us on Zoom from our Washington, D.C. Bureau. Good to have you with us this afternoon, Jennifer. So take us through why you think that even though Xi Jinping will not be here, his presence will be felt.
That's absolutely right. And the reason for that is that China has been making sustained and quite strategic investments in its influence in the UN. This goes from everything to building a coalition within UNGA, which is the body that all these world leaders are currently addressing this week, to building investments in sort of a pipeline of leadership talent within the UN staff system, to its funding contributions, which have risen to being the second largest in absolute terms behind the US, as well as strategic investments, particularly in the developing world space, which, as we're hearing from a lot of the leaders speaking today in New York, is a major priority for the body.
It's interesting. When you think about the UN and the influence, China and the United States on par, equal, or does one have more influence today?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on how you break it down. I think the United States continues to have a lot of structural advantages in terms of the fact that it and its allies occupy 3/5 of the permanent seats on the UN Security Council, which is a very powerful decision-making body with the UN. The US remains the largest contributor in absolute terms to the UN's budget. Many more UN staff are employed or nationals of the United States or its allies. So there are a lot of structural advantages there. Certainly China is gaining ground. And what's really interesting to look at is because the UN and UNGA in particular operates as one country, one vote, where China's really gaining influence is among developing economies, because unlike other international bodies where votes are weighted, in the UN, they all have an equal voice. And so getting developing countries, which are a huge portion of the UN membership, on board with your agenda or signing on to their agenda seems to be a pretty tried and true tactic. We saw the Soviet Union sort of exercise a similar strategy during the Cold War days.
So, Jennifer, I guess my question is about all the challenges that internally China has faced in recent months and in recent years with the recovery or lack thereof of the economy after the pandemic, and to what extent that actually decreases its power around the world. This is outside of the UN General Assembly, just with geographical power. I mean, this is a country that was extending its reach in developing economies throughout the world, with building ports, building roads, exporting vehicles. Does that change if there's a property crisis and if there's high youth unemployment?
This is a really key question for folks looking at the economic and geopolitical impact of China's slowdown. I think on the geopolitical side, we shouldn't overestimate the impact there. China's going to continue to be a major player on the world stage, not only in the UN, but a model for developing countries, one that they'll continue to look to, particularly those that, for whatever reason, don't feel that close to the U.S. or the West or are more distrustful of that model. I think China's sort of structural advantages are still going to be really prominent. So, for example, they're going to continue to invest in their technological advancement, and that's going to pose competition to the United States and the West, as we've seen with the new Huawei smartphone, right? Mm-hmm. In the military domain, they're continuing to invest in their military advancement, something else that Washington has cited as kind of a key area of concern in this rivalry. And then I think in terms of soft power, again, even though their economy is slowing down, it's going to remain a very large economy. It may at some point still surpass the U.S., perhaps for a much shorter period of time, but it's going away off the global stage.
I always think it's interesting, Jennifer, when you've got like this body, the United Nations, that is working on global issues, right? And to some extent trying to be very objective, and yet it's funded by nations. And the US and China are, right, the top funders, right? Or correct me if I'm wrong. So I do think about the money coming in, which is important to this body's existence, but how that influences things. I know it shouldn't, but I just wonder how that's a factor.
No, I think that's a really good question. And it also depends about which fund you're looking at, right? So there's the sort of funding that goes to the overall institution, and then there's sort of dedicated funds. So for example, a few years ago, China invested $200 million to set up a new peace and development fund that they have really tied to President Xi Jinping's own sort of global initiatives around security and development, which are very much embedded in the way in which China sees sort of security and development priorities. So for example, elevating the interests of the state over human rights. And that's been one way in which Beijing's definitely been able to put its stamp on global development and more broadly on the UN. I think the other major challenge the UN faces, as we were kind of indicating through this conversation, right? In UNGA, where it's one country, one vote, and there's a lot of sort of different opinions, not only different ranges of economic development, but very different political systems at play. It's often hard to see UNGA kind of coalesce around major decisions that move policy. The same is true in the UN Security Council, where the decisions by that body are supposed to be binding on members, but with Russia and China holding 2 of the permanent seats and veto power, and the US, UK, and France holding the other 3, there's not a lot of issues, and I think increasingly it's becoming more challenging for them to reach consensus on. Otherwise, one party ends up vetoing a resolution and it all falls apart. And that's the interesting thing to watch right now with China exercising its veto power more often. You're starting to see even the UNSC is really struggling to come to consensus on issues when they have the ability to drive policy.
I'm wondering what you made of President Biden's speech this morning, Jennifer. One thing that stuck out to me, and it's the second time I've mentioned this on the program, he delivered remarks at the UN General Assembly this morning, and he said, among other things, the U.S. is for de-risking with China, not decoupling.
Yes. And that's been a consistent refrain, not just from Washington, but interesting also from the EU, who was kind of the initial buzzword creator here.
I was going to say, is it marketing?
Yeah, because it
Do they have a meeting and they say, hey guys, let's change the marketing or let's change the slogan?
Decoupling sounds edgy.
But is it significant to say that?
I think it's a conscious uncoupling, Carol, I believe is what it is.
Nicely said. No, but is it a significant message that the U.S. is trying to send to China?
I do think it's a significant difference between decoupling and de-risking. De-risking implies, as the Biden administration has put it, right, a high fence around a small yard. So we're not cutting off everything. We're cutting off things that Washington perceives have a national security dimension to it. Beijing would, I think seek to contest that all of those applications are national security in nature. But that's sort of the Biden administration's pitch here, as opposed to other perspectives that might vote for, a full uncoupling, as you had put it, of trade and economic relations. And yes, this is a message that the Biden administration has been trying to send to Beijing for quite some time now. That was a huge focus of Commerce Secretary Raimondo's recent trip to China as well. I think Beijing probably remains skeptical of that argument. Again, from their perspective, a lot of the export controls and other restrictions have broader applications beyond just the national security domain. And beyond that, I think there's a long-held belief in Beijing that Washington naturally would seek to sort of contain China's rise, because that's what powerful countries do. It's a very realist mindset and approach to kind of geopolitics, but it's against that backdrop that I think all of Washington's moves over the past few years have been sort of judged against.
Well, fascinating conversation. So great to check in with you. Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst Jennifer Welch, really tying so much of what's going on with the UN General Assembly as the backdrop. Really fascinating. Geopolitics, geoeconomics.
I mean,
it's complicated.
It isn't, but it's front and center on today's program, whether it's the
Totally.
big take, whether it's, what's going on at the UN General Assembly this week. By the way, Carol, what's it like outside right now? Did you have...
It's gorgeous.
Okay, that's not what I was asking.
No, it wasn't so bad.
It wasn't so bad?
No, remember last time we couldn't get back to the show?
We couldn't get back to our show. We had to go underground.
Because President Biden was coming through.
Exactly.
All right, guys, don't go anywhere. We got more to come right here on Bloomberg Radio.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We begin with a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. JP Morgan Chase is raising its quarterly dividend to $1.05 a share versus $1. So again, JP Morgan Chase raising its quarterly dividend to $1.05. It was a down day on Wall Street today with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining. S&P down 9, drop there of 0.2%. The Dow down 106, lower today by 0.3%. NASDAQ today fell 32 points, a decline of just about 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.36%, the 2-year 5.09%. Spot gold down $2.50 the ounce to $19.41, a drop there of 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.2%, $91.64 a barrel. First day of trading for Instacart, and the shares advanced today by 12.3%. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 9, drop there of 0.2%. That 2-year bears repeating 5.09% with the 10-year 4.36%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. This next voice is going to sound familiar because we caught up with him at the Milken Institute Global Conference earlier this year. So great to have back with us in studio Hans Kobler. He's founder and managing partner of Energy Impact Partners. They have about $3 billion in assets under management. They invest in clean energy technologies, and they help deploy them through partnerships with companies trying to decarbonize. He is in town for Climate Week, and as I said, he's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Nice to have you here with Tim and myself.
Great being here.
Welcome back. Come on closer to the mic, because we want to make sure we can hear you. The energy transition. Let's start basic. How's it going?
It's going well. It's picking up momentum. We had the first year in history that more money was spent on the energy transition than on traditional energy, 1.1 trillion. So the momentum is building.
A tipping point?
It's a tipping point. But it's the beginning. It's the first inning of a long, long race. If you believe McKinsey and some forecasts, we will need $8-9 trillion a year, 150 trillion. That's 15 internets, or 1.5 times the global economy spent over the next few decades.
That's a lot.
That's a lot, and we may not get there, but we are taking it serious. So it's picking up momentum.
Well, one thing that I think about when it comes to the energy transition is the role of nuclear power. And here in the U.S., it's a really checkered history. It's a really checkered past. It's very expensive for us to build nuclear power plants. There are always cost overruns, and then you have the legacy of Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and Chernobyl. What are your thoughts on nuclear?
I think so. We have a lot of corporate partners in our investor group. The Southern Company was the last one here to try to build a nuclear plant. They finally got them all online, which is great. We have EDF as an investor that had 55 in the country running, and half of them didn't work when they shut down the Russian gas. And TEPCO was an investor too. So nuclear, the clean energy transition is amazing, and a lot will be wind and solar, but you need the base load, and nuclear is still the best way to get to the base load. So I think it's critical to keep that in the arsenal. I'm from Germany originally. I mean, you can tell the accent. Probably the greenest country that has most ambitions to go clean. They spend a ton on
but they're even
wind and
shutting down
solar,
their nuclear.
And they shut down, which is a stupid thing to do.
It's, is this reversible?
Yeah, but it's hard. It's
hard.
It's hard. Once you shut down an industry, you have to build up the talent to build new nuclear plants. You can.
But I guess my question is, can we transition to net zero without nuclear?
Right. How crucial is it?
Hard. The transition to net zero is not only converting what we have today, but to deal with the demand that we are facing. We have had a flat demand curve in this country for 20 years. We are now electrifying transportation. We are building data centers running on AI, where one Google search, where one AI search is taking about 50 to 100 times more power than a Google search. So you're talking about doubling the infrastructure that we built over 100 years. If Elon Musk is out there saying, no, whatever you are calculating, it's going to be triple. So you need a lot of electrons. And so there is not one solution for that. That means we have to use different tools in the toolkit to get there, and get there a lot faster than we have been.
But Hans, can we do it, this energy transformation, without nuclear?
Yes, but I think it would be a lot cheaper if we did it with nuclear. And at the end of the day, we have to address something that we call in the industry trilemma. Everyone wants to go clean, but when you face not having power at all, security, reliability gets on the horizon. And when the Germans pay 12 times more for natural gas than the Americans and 4 times more for electricity, then affordability comes in, right? So that's an equation. This trilemma is an equation very difficult to solve.
But also motivation perhaps to invest in renewable sources that in the long run are less expensive.
Absolutely, but in a way, in our view, the only way to solve that equation of this trilemma is to really apply innovation. That means you need new technologies, great technologies, and you need to collaborate. You need to involve the incumbents, the existing infrastructure sit on trillions of dollars of investments that we have to help them get there faster. That's, by the way, is the business model that we have, where we team up with corporates and bring them together in a room with the innovators and the capital to forge those alliances to accelerate that transition. Look, everybody wants to see the rosy sky, but you got to be pragmatic about it, and that means we got to work together and work faster and harder than we have in the past.
So when you have those conversations and those collaborations, what is it that you speak most about? Tim brought up nuclear, right? And we feel like it's become such a no-no. Is it nuclear? Is it hydro? Is it solar? Is it EV? Like, what is it that you guys spend a lot of time talking about with your partners?
Yeah, yes.
Check.
Yes, so it is a complex undertaking. We need to decarbonize supply. We need to create a lot more supply, so that's one focus area. The second one is we need to create sustainable demand. That means electrifying a lot of the industries, from transportation to home heating to the data centers, indoor agriculture. And then you have to deal with the high intermittency you create. So I was just telling you, it's 2 to 3 times more power that we need, but at its peak, it could be 5 times as much. It's like building a church for Easter Sunday, and somehow we have to balance that. And that means you have to invest in transmission distribution, which is very difficult, right? It took 15 years to get the clean electrons from Canada through 2 of the greenest states to New York, because nobody wants to build anything in their backyard.
Right.
You build storage, and great technologies are coming up. You're an investor in Form, we invest in Power, and so, but that's a lot of space that is needed and takes some time. Or you digitize the communication between the customer and the supplier, and you tell them, look, don't charge your car at 6 o'clock, do it at midnight.
Right.
Turn down, it's nice and cool in here, and it's nice and cool in here, just don't cool right now because everybody's cooling.
Can I ask you, we've only about 30 seconds left here. Would you invest in a fossil fuel energy company, an oil and gas company?
No.
You wouldn't anymore?
No,
even though there's going to be demand for years.
Some people, look, we need certainly natural gas for a long, long time.
And I know you're kind of talking your book, because that's not
we need natural gas for a long, long time.
Okay.
But we personally would not invest. We are a fund focused on, we are an Article 9 fund. We invest in things that decarbonize the global economy.
But if you weren't, would you?
If I was a financial investor, I would.
Okay. All right. Love having you come here. Always provocative. I always learn something. Come back soon.
Yeah, will do.
Hans Kobler. He's founder and managing partner, Energy Impact Partners, here in our studio. All right, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week.
Well, the latest state revenue report from the Urban Institute identified a substantial and persistent drop in revenue flowing into state coffers. This after 3 years of state legislatures throwing wild tax-cutting parties thanks to being awash in revenue from a durable economy and federal pandemic relief dollars.
All right, so let's get into all of this because there's a lot of data on it with our next guest. Attending today's Earthshot Prize and Bloomberg Philanthropies Innovation Summit at the Plaza, New York City, New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli. He joins us from the Plaza. A lot going on. I'm curious, and thank you, first of all, for joining us. We so appreciate it. What's top of mind for you right now? There is a lot going on in terms of strengths and stresses for the state of New York.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking closely at the revenue trends, and, we're down about 13% year over year. But, keep in mind, the budget is based on projections, and in terms of the current projections, we're actually slightly ahead of what was anticipated. But again, keep in mind, those projections were lowered. So we're dealing with a changing revenue picture. If things stay on course, we should be able to keep this year's budget in balance. But heading into next year, which isn't that far off to start working on next year's budget, we have a budget gap of over $9 billion. that could grow, it could be less. It depends on where this economy is headed. And given all the uncertainty and volatility, it really requires a very close monitoring of the revenue picture and being careful about spending when we make our decisions next year.
How often do you guys, in terms of Comptroller Di Napoli, that when you talk about kind of what happens next year, how often do you talk about the potential for recession and what that impact might have on the state?
Yeah, well, you know, the economists have been projecting a recession, I don't know how many months or how many years. It doesn't seem to happen, which I guess is good news. The general view is at some point there will be some kind of a downturn. But that's really, you know, the uncertainty that's out there. The good news is the current budget built up our statutory and informal reserves, our rainy day funds, so we're a little better positioned than we were a couple of years ago to weather an economic downturn. But New York is not as well positioned as some other states in that regard. So I really think as we start to look at next year's budget, we have to be very careful about spending. You had some big spending increases this year. That was somewhat contingent on the federal relief money still being there. That's being spent down. And an economy that is starting to slow. And that's reflected in the revenue numbers coming in less than we had forecast going back, you know, February, March, when this current budget was first being put together.
Comptroller, talk to us about the migrant crisis here. It's certainly top of mind, not just for the people who it's affecting, but also for the people who set the budgets and the people who run budgets around the city. Earlier this month, you said that unbudgeted costs for housing asylum seekers and other humanitarian efforts will quickly exceed the city's resources. How long do we have here in New York City before the city runs out of cash to pay for asylum seekers?
Well, the city is similar to the state in that the current budget is relatively in good shape because of prior years and rolling some of that surplus money over. But you know, the mayor, anticipating that there may not be the additional federal and or state support to deal with these exploding costs of dealing with the migrant crisis, has ordered now 3 successive 5% cuts in the current budget. That could really impact on services. So I think that's a strong message to say Mayor Adams wants to be sure that the budget will be kept in balance, but without additional help, particularly from Washington, you could see some very direct impact on city services at a time that we're trying to keep the city's recovery moving in the right direction. So, you know, the city is estimating some $12 billion in terms of the next couple of years of cost. The state financial plan has about $1.5 billion in it for migrants. The governor has indicated some more money will be put aside for that. But I don't see how the state or the city can get through this without additional federal support that so far has not been forthcoming.
How much federal support would you want?
Well, you know, at one point, the idea was thrown out by the city to do a third, a third, a third. A third from the city, a third from the state, a third from the federal government. You know, that would be a nice cost sharing if that was possible. Look, the other piece of this has been talked about a great deal. They need to expedite the work authorization so that these folks that want to work, want to fill those jobs that aren't being filled, can in fact be off of being supported by government. So I think another piece of it is getting these individuals back into the workforce so they can provide for themselves. So there are a lot of moving parts here, but so much of it gets back to federal policy in terms of work authorization, gets back to federal support in terms of dollars to help our city and our state contend with this big influx of migrant families.
How much of a financial impact, though, do you ultimately see the asylum seekers, those coming to New York, having on the city and the state overall?
I mean, it's hard to quantify right now because we don't know whether or not the federal government will step up. But I think the mayor's figure for the city of a cost of $12 billion, I think that's a realistic number. And the city clearly has not budgeted for that. And as you mentioned in the earlier question, that would wipe out, you know, the reserves that the city has had. What does that mean? That means service cuts or raising taxes. You know, those are not welcome alternatives. So we really need to have, you know, all the key players and stakeholders come together and figure out a solution here. We don't want the city to go backwards. We're still not 100% recovered from the depths of the COVID close down. We have not grown back all the jobs that we lost. There are a lot of challenges out there. This was an unexpected one, and in the short run, a very costly one.
Do you have any concerns about the city's spending on contracts related to housing and services for asylum seekers who are entering the city? Do you have any plans to audit any of the providers?
Well, keep in mind we have a city controller that has a more direct role on city contracts. So, and as you know, Controller Lander has already indicated he's going to do some real-time auditing of one of those big contracts. Yeah, I mean, look, we have some of these same issues at the state level. Whenever you have an emergency declaration and the normal procedures for procurement, which require review at the state level from the state controller, at the city level from the city controller, whenever you eliminate that in the interests of an emergency and trying to expedite the spending, you lose some of the checks and balances that ensure that you're getting the right value for the taxpayers and for the city or for the state. So I do think it is appropriate that these contracts be more closely scrutinized, and I would hope we would limit the emergency period and get back to the kind of reviews that would ensure best value. You know, it's often argued that, well, we have an emergency, we need efficiency, we don't need the controllers to be looking at this. The reality is, whether it's a city controller, state controller, we turn around contracts very quickly, especially if it's an urgent situation. So to cut us out of that review process, big mistake in the long run, and that's why you have some of the questions being raised on some of these contracts.
Thomas, one thing I think about too, and we were talking about federal aid coming to the city for the asylum seekers to help out with the cost of that. The upcoming presidential elections, just, you know, they're just around the corner next year. Are you concerned, as someone who has to keep track of the state's finances and keep it all in check, if you will, about a changing of the guard in the White House potentially, and how that could impact states financially, and your state specifically?
Well, obviously, whoever's in the White House will have a big impact. You know, I think in the short run, the gridlock we're seeing in Congress right now with the split between the Senate and the House already is causing, you know, some concern about where we're headed for the future. And obviously, this will be a very contentious presidential election. I do hope the candidates talk about the relationship between the federal government and the states and what the federalism means, what their vision is for the future. We've benefited mightily from the relief money that's come in, the infrastructure money, some of the money's coming with the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, where are we headed? That's going to be the big focus of debate. I'll want to hear from all the candidates as to what their plans are to help the states and our local governments deal with this challenging fiscal environment.
Comptroller, I wanted to get your thoughts on license plate obstruction. It's certainly turned into a major problem here in New York City. According to the MTA, it loses around $50 million a year in evaded tolls and tunnels. The Port Authority loses more than $40 million, those figures from the New York Times. It's addition to money that's lost from red light cameras, speed zone cameras meant to make roads safer. What are you guys doing about this issue in the city, especially as we get close to congestion pricing? I think we might have lost
Do we have an audio problem, maybe? All right, I think we have, unfortunately, an audio problem. Our thanks very much to New York State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli joining us from the Plaza, of course, attending today's Earthshot Prize and Bloomberg Philanthropies Innovation Summit.
Hey, in the meantime, let's get a check on how the trading day ended up. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much. We ended up lower across the board. A lot of red on the screen today. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all declining. S&P was down 9, drop there of 0.2%. The Dow was down 106, lower by just about 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 32, a decline of 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.36% with a 2-year yielding 5.09%. Treasury yields climbed. Stocks fell ahead of the Fed's decision tomorrow, with traders betting rates will be higher for longer to prevent an inflation flare-up. As for what to expect from the FOMC, Charles Tan is co-CIO of Global Fixed Income at American Century Investments, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
You're not going to pause, you're not going to sound hawkish. So there still might be a chance of a hike in November. But we believe by the time when November comes around, economic data will be weak enough for them to say this is it.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. First day of trading today for Instacart. It racked up a 12% trading debut gain in one of the year's biggest IPOs, showing investors are receptive to the online grocery delivery firm's pivot to advertising. And it also adds momentum to a rebound for U.S. listings. Again, Instacart today up by 12.3%. Recapping stocks lower with the S&P down 9, down 0.2%. Spot gold down $2.50 the ounce to $19.31, down 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude 91.66 a barrel, up 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic live here on Bloomberg Business Week.
Oh, we're live.
We are live.
We are live.
Yeah, we are all live, too. Thank God. It's Climate Week in New York against the backdrop of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly. You know that. We've been talking about it. The UN has identified 17 specific SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, including building out resilient technology infrastructure. And to get there and reach some of those 17 SDGs, the UN has highlighted high-impact initiatives, among them unlocking the data dividend, which our next guest participated in an event that happened here this week. With us is Johannes Uting. Am I saying it right?
Perfect.
Okay, he's being kind. But he's executive head of the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century. The acronym is Paris 21, which is hosted by the OECD in Paris. I have to say, though, Johannes, former member of the UN Secretary General's expert group on the data revolution. He's a development economist, expertise in employment, social protection, healthcare, financing, and gender. He's looked at the world in a lot of different ways, and we are delighted to have him here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And I've learned about Paris 21 because my daughter has done an internship with you all this summer, so full transparency. But I've learned a lot. Tell us, though, in your words, your mission and your goals, what you guys are all about.
Paris 21 stands for Partnership in Statistics in Development for the 21st Century. We basically do three things. We help countries with technical capacity development, national statistical offices. So we help training of managers in statistical offices in poor countries like Rwanda and others. So we organize trainings. We help with coordination in many parts of when you produce data. There are many ministries involved, there are development agencies involved, and we help them to get coordinated. And last but not least, we do advocacy. And you just mentioned the UNGA Week, the SDG Summit. And we do advocacy for more and better funding for data and statistics.
Well, what's interesting, in a world that's so overrun with data, we just assume it's good. No, we don't assume it's good. We talk about biased data and kind of dirty data, not great data. But not all data is good. Not all data is productive or useful, right? And so you guys are involved in that, in helping countries develop infrastructure so that they can actually accumulate their own data sets, correct?
Absolutely correct. Yeah. I think what is a bit difficult sometimes to understand is, on the one hand, we have a data tsunami. We have all these data, digital data, which is very good, which is feeding artificial intelligence and innovation. On the other hand, we have, and on the other hand, we have data gaps. Terrible data gaps. In some countries, we don't even know of how many people in a country are living. We have difficulties to measure birth rates and to register those people. We have a lot of data gaps in the SDGs. We, in particular on climate change or gender equality, we are literally flying blind. Mm-hmm. So we are supporting as Paris 21 with our partners to close those data gaps, to be able to do better decisions, but also to hold our governments accountable. I think that's also a very important aspect of this, so that if you say you want to reduce poverty in a given country by X%, you want to have the start point and the end point, and you want to see if this is on track.
We've talked a lot this year about AI and the impact that AI is having on companies whose stocks are publicly traded. What about when it comes to your work and how you can use AI to make sense of this data and help these poorer countries actually make positive change? Are you using it?
An excellent question. I mean, what we see is that there are two, I mean, we often talk about silos, right? I mean, and this is a real silo. On the one hand, we have people talking about the data that you were just mentioning, feeding into the algorithms and that supporting these AI-driven innovation. And on the other hand, we have data for development, which is an own space by itself, and there's not enough crossover. If you look at the G20 statement at the last one, there is a working group on data for development, and there is a working group on digital data. So there is yet not enough overlap. I think it's about to close, and artificial intelligence for the public good is, of course, very important. But also the quality of the data that you feed into it is essential. Garbage in, garbage out. Exactly.
I knew you were going to say that.
So the quality of the data to help countries produce verified quality statistics even is very essential and often, unfortunately, not in the spotlight.
Well, you can't have transformative, I'm stealing words from you guys, but transformative policy without transformative data, correct?
Absolutely correct, yeah.
Well, and I'm curious about, you know, in a world where there's lots of stress points, I'm thinking, you know, the hottest world, right? Hottest temperatures on record. So there's a lot going, you know, a lot of focus on climate. But investment in infrastructure systems so that the data collection is better. How tough is that to get the money going where it needs to go?
That's unfortunately, it's a very, very difficult exercise. So we currently spend around 600–700 million on data and statistics from official development aid, ODA aid. And this is less than a percentage point since years. So we would need to ramp up significantly the international support for data and statistics, but we also need to convince countries to invest part of their taxpayers' money, domestic resources, into it. And the payoff, I mean, the thing is, if I invest into a hospital, if you are a minister, what would you do? Would you invest in a hospital or in vaccination or education? Or would you invest in a national statistical office?
Right.
You would probably be the first,
Yeah.
because then you can
That's
show
right.
after 2–3 years it's done. These benefits for investment in national statistical systems will only take time, the benefit will take time 10–15 years later. They feed into everything else.
Sell us on it. You know, if you're trying to sell a minister on making this investment, how do you do it?
What's the cost by not making those investments?
What we say is if you want to have, I mean, for instance, economic growth, I mean, it's very critical to have a very good understanding about key economic indicators, right? And if those are not sort of measured in your country, you will not be able to, first of all, to make very good decisions. You will not invest your public resources very efficiently. You are not even able to tell you if you do it or not. So in that sense, we are not asking for a lot of money. It's peanuts. It's literally peanuts. And there are a lot of, we have a lot of good tools at hand to help. So I think for a minister, and many planning ministers actually know this, and they are behind this. It's sometimes just the politics behind, which is a bit difficult.
No, politics, no. But what's interesting is
Not here in the US.
I think about the amount of investment decisions that are made up of like all of the US economic statistics or global statistics right in the developed world. We've got about a minute and a half left. Johannes, you know,
We've got a lot of time.
Oh, we have a
Carol,
little bit
don't
more.
worry.
Sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You know, it's been that kind of crazy day. So I think about like our audience who's listening, a smart financial investment audience. What is it that they need to understand about, again, the importance of it and potentially the payoff? Or what's being missed by not accurately having data on a lot of different countries?
I think we have to talk about the opportunities and the investment opportunities. We will have next year in Medellin a World Data Forum.
Yeah.
So all your listeners, your community is cordially invited, because we are working more and more with the private sector, of course, with the big companies that have a lot of data. They make those data also because we were asking about AI. I will later today attend by Google an AI for public good. There are many other companies who are actively engaging. I think they could do a little bit more, though, and also sees it as a public good. So I think for the many of our colleagues and partners from the private sector are interested. So are civil society organizations, by the way. And to bring them together in multi-partnership, that's the partnership part, is very important.
How can we make the data collection easier from the perspective of these countries? And I'm thinking about public-private partnerships specifically. I mean, think about the data that, you know, a mobile phone company has about what somebody does on their phone, transactions that they make. I mean, you can get really granular information that can tell stories about an economy. What's the role of a private company in working with the government to provide that data? Because there are some privacy concerns too.
It's on point, exactly how you say. On the one hand, I mean, we call this public-private partnership. And there are some really very nice public-private partnership out there where telephone companies share confidentially and secure the data. But of course, it's a business risk as well. I mean, and you have to see what has happened to this data and so on and so forth. But there are some very good promising examples of how what we call big data, specifically on geospatial data, is used, for instance, on poverty mapping, day and night satellite imagery. So you can look at a given country and you can compare the light nights and you can compare it with a day, and then you can make a sort of calculation, do these people have light, electricity or not? And from this, with other data, you can estimate how poor people are, and you also know for your investors where maybe you can put some infrastructure to solve this problem.
You know, and that's what I was thinking about. It was interesting. I was over at the Earthshot Prize, Bloomberg Philanthropies event, and we talked with some of the finalists of the Earthshot Prize, and they've come up with different ways to decarbonize the world. And one of the things, let's talk about what you're doing, but then it's like, what's the impact? Talk to us about some of either the data sets that you have helped accumulate and what it has led to. If you can give us some examples.
Of course. I mean, we do a lot of country work, and in specifically one area which is very important is on gender. So in some parts of this world, I mean, through our support in the Maldives, in Colombia, in Africa, in many countries, we have now more sex disaggregated data, which is fantastic for many different purposes. I mean, this will help.
Sounds so basic, right? But
yeah, absolutely. I mean, to sort of to know of how many men and women there are, children. So we have quite a couple of countries where we can show success, where we can show impact, and this impact is leading governments also to invest more into data and statistics. So you can say the glass is maybe more half full than half empty in our area, but through these events like what we have here at the highest level, we had the DSG, Amina Mohamed was opening the High Impact Initiative. We had another event, just a breakfast on 7 a.m. in the morning, full room, very, very important people. So there is more consideration for the topic. And I'm rather optimistic then for the next 8 years that we can give it a big push, and we will be able to convince more people that this is an important part of the development nexus.
Johannes, you talked about Google and like the meeting that you've had, or the conversations you've had, and I do wonder about how much increasingly the private sector can play in all of this. It's interesting. We had a guest yesterday, and we talked about the Roaring 20s and the crash and FDR, and we talked about who were the power brokers back then. And it was, the Carnegies and, those kind of folks who were industrialists. Today's power brokers are the data CEOs and the data companies. What you are trying to do, does it increasingly have to come from the private sector, or does that not necessarily give you the purest data that you want? I'm trying to think for the right word.
It's a very, very important question.
Because they have so much.
They have so much data, but of course data is also linked to power. And it has lots of questions about confidentiality. It's about the safe use of the data. And of course, these companies want to make business. What we are talking here is about a public good. So if you talk specifically about a specific subcategory like official statistics, I would say this should stay in the hand of governments. There are certain criteria, we have principles for how to produce those things. It's a public good. We don't know what happens to those data, but I think some of these data is just essential for the government, for private sector, for civil society as well, to see where a country stands. How is about the education system. So to leave this to the private sector, I don't think is a good idea. To have the private sector feed into those official statistics, that's a very different question. But we need to be on the same level playing field. And we just talked about the numbers. If you look at the budget of an official statistical office in a poor country, and you compare it with any other private sector funding, it's very clear where the how the power relationship is.
Will investor money not flow in if you don't have those data sets?
Well, to some extent,
curious about the relationship.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's flowing in. But then we make in some countries where we this birth registration that I mentioned, death registration, this is terrible mistakes are possible, and also sort of investments that are not sort of leading to the estimated results. I mean, the middle class, for instance, you want to know as an investor, the middle class in India, is it 500 million? How big is it actually?
Do you always trust the data?
No. No, not at all. I mean, there is. I mean, there were. But there is also
without calling out individual countries specifically, or feel free to.
Yeah. I mean, there are. We can talk about the past.
Even the developed markets, right? We question some of the U.S. statistics. But
there are two examples that very well known. It's Greece and also Argentina at some point in the past, and that was about the inflation CPI. Which is very well documented. So the good thing is that there is a trusted community that would call out those misbehavior. There's also a misunderstanding sometimes. There is not one truth in the data. That is not, it's not truth. What's important is you make it very clear that you abide to statistical standards and that the data is sort of produced with a certain quality standards, and you make it very open. And then you can start this debate about it, which is really more fascinating than you sometimes tend to believe.
I know from my daughter that, because she's done work with you guys on gender. Why gender versus healthcare versus employment versus financing? Or how do you choose where you want to focus on? How does that, or is that determined by the money that comes in and somebody's interest, or how do you figure? Because there's so many probably different ways you could go.
Absolutely. I mean, the demand is immense. Yeah. I think many of the questions around gender are underpinning every other sector. If you look at development, we look often at sectors. We look at agriculture, we look at health, we look at education, and we try to improve all those sectors. And the SDGs have 17 different quote-unquote sectors. Gender is underpinning everything. I mean, in terms of if we invest in good investment in gender statistics, which could be, I mean, sex disaggregated data, but also access to gender-based violence, or which is important to document as well. So it's underpinning all other sectors, and what you also probably have talked about quite a lot in the show is about the economic benefit to use the potential of women's empowerment, in particular, for instance, to access to ownership rights of resources, land, credit, insurance. Right. So once you unlock this potential, once you have an opportunity and you know how many women have access to land and what kind of land and credit and education, this will help you to make targeted investment, and which helps for all other sectors. So it's a huge multiplier effect next to there's an intrinsic value that women and men should be treated equally.
Okay, what about when it comes to data collection and how different countries are collecting data? Are you seeing, in terms of developing countries that don't necessarily have the infrastructure built in, are you seeing them invest in technologies that are so-called leapfrogging technologies that allow them to sort of bypass the big infrastructure investments that were made in the past? And I'm thinking like, ways to provide internet to folks without wireline broadband, without actually digging holes, using satellites, being able to use data collection instead of launching satellites, use drones, for example.
This is happening, and I collected myself. When I did my master's thesis, I went to a couple of countries and collected data for my own thesis. So I was working with national statistical offices, and we had these paper forms. So you went with a paper form with a questionnaire, and you asked all these questions, and then you went back, and then you had to type it in. I have seen statistical office packed with lots of paper, and you can imagine.
Sounds so quaint.
It looks like in your office more or less. Anyway, so this is changing now using mobile phones. Yeah. And